They called it the Wild West, but it was never just guns, gold, and gunfights. It was dust in your teeth, laws made on the fly, and 1,000 miles between facts and legends. A place where time zones were invented, trains outran horses, and fortunes vanished before sunrise. This wasn't a movie. It was messier, louder, weirder, and somehow real. Tonight, we're digging up 101 historical facts they didn't teach you in school. Stories stitched into saddle leather, sung over campfires, and carved into trees. Strap in. The West wasn't tamed. It just changed costumes. 1. The Wild West most people picture spans roughly 1865 to 1895, from the Civil War's end to the Census Bureau declaring the frontier closed in 1895, 1890. It begins not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whisper. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier line, a shifting statistical ghost used to track population density, no longer existed. Just like that, the Wild West was closed. Or so they claimed. Because the real Wild West wasn't a time period. It was a fever dream, stitched together by dime novels, whiskey breath, and post-war angst. But for the sake of order, we draw borders, even on chaos. The version that stuck, saloon doors swinging, six-shooters blazing, morally ambiguous cowboys riding into painted sunsets, mostly covers the 30 years between 1865 and 1895. After the Civil War ended, the country needed a new conflict, a new theater for its unresolved tensions. So it looked west. What it found was dust, gold, and 100 different stories, none of them clean. This was the era of cattle drives and contested treaties, of buffalo skulls and barbed wire, of desperate migration and frontier law. But perhaps more importantly, it was the age when myth overtook memory. The Civil War had broken something. The West was where people went to forget it, or bury it, or reinvent themselves entirely. Whether they were fleeing debts, demons, or history, the West offered a rare commodity, the illusion of a blank slate. Of course, it was never blank. People were already there. Landscapes were already mapped. But the illusion was useful, profitable even. And as the decades passed, this rugged 30-year span hardened into something else. Legend. By 1890, the census clerks stamped it all done, as if a continent's trauma could be filed and shelved. But just 1 year before, steel tracks had reached a mountaintop in Utah, and everything had changed. 2. The Transcontinental Railroad met at Promontory Summit, Utah, in 1869, shrinking months-long overland journeys to about a week. They met in the middle with champagne bottles, silver hammers, and 36 reporters. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the final spike, painted gold, not built to last, was tapped into place. East met West with a ceremonial clang. In reality, the spike was quickly replaced with something more durable, just like the myth would be. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't merely a triumph of steel and schedule. It was a surgical redrawing of time and space. Suddenly, what used to take 3 to 6 grueling, dysentery-riddled months in a wagon could be done in about 7 days, give or take a landslide. From New York to San Francisco in a week. It was the industrial age's first real magic trick. Of course, behind that magic were thousands of laborers, Irish immigrants from the East, Chinese immigrants from the West, laying track under brutal conditions, through mountains that didn't want to be split and deserts that swallowed water like secrets. Many didn't live to see the lines connect. Fewer still got statues, but the train didn't just bring speed, it brought definition. Once the land was gridded with timetables and ticket prices, the idea of frontier became harder to defend. The railroad made the West smaller, more accessible, more colonized. Commerce, settlers, soldiers, and rumors now traveled faster than the wind. Small towns bloomed like mushrooms around depots. Large ones exploded into cities. And with the tracks came law. And with law came violence pretending to be order. Still, for a while the engine itself remained the hero. Steel rails were cleaner than blood after all, and they were good for business. But before trains ruled the trails, there was a slower, dustier form of movement. Something with wooden wheels and too many horses. 3. Before the railroad, the Butterfield Overland Mail, 1858 to 61, ran stagecoaches on a 2,800-mile route from Missouri to California. Imagine it, a lumbering, dust-choked stagecoach rolling across 2,800 miles of wilderness, dodging floods, bandits, axle breaks, and sometimes bad coffee. From Missouri to California, twice a week, no matter the weather. The Butterfield Overland Mail was the closest thing America had to a circulatory system in the late 1850s. Arteries of news and passengers stretching across a body of unsettled land. It wasn't glamorous. 6 dusty passengers, 2 rows of benches, 0 legroom. You were jostled for 3 weeks straight, eating dust by day and bugs by lantern light. If you were lucky, you arrived with your spine still in alignment. If not, well, the Butterfield ran right past enough boot hills to solve that problem. But it worked. Founded in 1858, it promised to get letters and light freight from St. Louis to San Francisco in under 25 days. And somehow it usually did. The stage ran day and night, swapping horses every 20 miles at relay stations that were half fortress, half stable, and always understocked on comfort. Drivers were tough, wiry men with iron stomachs and worse tempers. Shotguns rode next to them, loaded and ready. It was communication under pressure. Industrial logistics applied to dirt roads and vague maps. And for a brief moment, it was the fastest way west, until war and wires rendered it obsolete. By 1861, the Civil War and the telegraph both swept in like faster, sharper ideas. The Overland Mail was rerouted, then canceled. Its route faded into the terrain like so many wagon ruts. But for 3 hard, beautiful years, it was the frontier's postal vein. Its legacy? A demonstration of sheer willpower over geography. But willpower alone wasn't enough. The West wanted speed, and the telegraph delivered it with sparks. And before the wires stitched up the map, another courier would give it one last desperate gallop. 4. The Pony Express lasted only April 1860 to October 1861. The telegraph killed it faster than any outlaw ever could. For something so fast, the Pony Express didn't last long, just 18 months. April 1860 to October 1861. But in that short galloping window, it managed to saddle itself straight into legend. The basic concept? Take one wiry young man, one fast horse, and hand him a leather mochila stuffed with government dispatches, personal letters, and bad news from back east. Then send him flying across 1,900 miles of rough country at breakneck speed, rain or shine or ambush. Repeat every 10 miles with a fresh horse. Repeat every 100 with a new rider. Hope none of them disappear. The ads famously asked for skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, orphans preferred. Not because they were expendable, though that's one interpretation, but because they were desperate, and desperate men do brave, stupid things. They rode from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, in 10 days, shaving weeks off the standard mail routes. In a time of tension, it was the fastest line between the fractured East and the ever-expanding West, but the glory was unsustainable. The Pony Express was a financial sinkhole. And in the background, something quieter, more permanent was humming into existence. The telegraph. Wires strung across the wilderness didn't need oats, didn't throw shoes, and didn't get shot at. On October 24, 1861, the final telegraph link between East and West was completed. 2 days later, the Pony Express was shut down. It never made money, but it made myth. It proved that the West could be connected by sheer grit. And when the wires finally replaced the hooves, they did it on the backs of those who'd already charted the trail. Riders faded into history. But the romance of speed, danger, and solitude stayed. And while the express was fading, the railroads were just beginning their land-hungry climb across the map. 5. Railroads received vast federal land grants, then sold parcels to settlers and town boosters, effectively designing new maps of the West. The railroads were supposed to connect the country. What they did instead was own it. The U.S. government, in its infinite generosity and frequent short-sightedness, handed over millions of acres of public land to railroad companies throughout the 19th century. The logic was simple: build the tracks, get the land. Specifically, for every mile of track laid, companies like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific received alternating sections of land on either side, checkerboard style, for miles. It was industrial manifest destiny with paperwork. But the railroads weren't sentimental, they were businesses, and land to them wasn't just for laying track, it was inventory. They turned around and sold those acres to settlers, speculators, and town boosters at a tidy profit. Entire communities sprang up around depots and sidings not because the land was fertile or the view was nice, but because the timetable said stop here. In effect, the railroads didn't just travel across the West, they created it. Towns were born with names like End of the Line, Railhead, or just Station Number. 6. Some boomed, some withered. All of them owed their existence to the whims of rail barons in distant boardrooms. And then there was the other map, the one that wasn't drawn. Native lands were bypassed, divided, or taken altogether. Trails that had existed for centuries were ignored or paved over. The new map was made of schedules, not stories. Still, for many settlers, this was the only version of the West they ever knew. A landscape of towns built overnight and promises sold by the acre. The railroads didn't just bring people west, they decided who got to stay. And when you're running a railroad empire, even time itself bends to your will, which is exactly what happened next. 6. Time zones in North America were standardized by the railroads in 1883, not by Congress. Timetables needed sanity. Before 1883, time was a local affair. Noon happened when the sun hit its peak, and every town set its clocks accordingly. That worked fine when most travel was done at the speed of a horse. But railroads ran on precision. And it's hard to run a railroad empire when noon in Chicago is 12:15 in Cincinnati, 11:50 in St. Louis, and no one agrees on what time the train actually arrives. The result was chaos. Dozens of conflicting local times made train schedules a bureaucratic nightmare and a safety hazard. Collisions weren't just mechanical failures, they were often caused by incompatible clocks. So, on November 18, 1883, the railroad companies took matters into their own hands. Without waiting for Congress or the president or anyone with a gavel, they declared the continent divided into 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. At precisely noon that day, over 300 railroad stations synchronized their clocks, effectively rebooting time across the country. It was called the Day of Two Noons. In towns across the West, clocks were stopped and reset. Some people grumbled. Some ministers declared it sacrilege. Others just wanted their trains to run on time. The government wouldn't officially adopt standard time for another 35 years. But by then, it didn't matter. The railroads had already decided reality. They didn't just reshape land. They reordered time itself. And that's the thing about the Wild West. It wasn't just untamed nature. It was a tug-of-war between chaos and control. Every schedule, every survey, every barbed wire fence was an attempt to pin down a moving myth. And as it turns out, the cowboys riding into the sunset, they weren't even original. They were borrowing saddles and style from a culture the West had already tried to forget. 7. Cowboys borrowed deeply from Mexican vaquero culture. saddles, lariats, reata, chaps, chaparreras, and cattle handling techniques. The American cowboy didn't invent the job. He inherited it, boots, spurs, and all, from someone south of the border. Long before the word cowboy was carved into popular culture, the vaquero was already out there, riding the dusty open range of what is now Mexico and the American Southwest. These were the original cattle hands, and they didn't just pass on a few tips, they wrote the entire manual. The vaquero saddle had a deep seat and a high pommel, built for long days and bucking livestock. Their reata, a braided rawhide lariat, was their signature tool, the prototype for every rope trick in a Hollywood Western. Chaps? The vaquero wore them first. In fact, the word chaparreras comes from the Spanish word for brush, because when you're pushing cattle through thorny country, thick leather leg coverings are less fashion and more survival. Even the methods of herding, branding, and breaking wild horses, the daily choreography of the cowboy, were deeply rooted in Mexican tradition. American cowboys didn't create this world. They stepped into it. And then, predictably, they rebranded it. Over time, English-speaking settlers and ranchers absorbed the tools and techniques, often stripping away the context, but keeping the gear. The cowboy became a symbol of American grit and independence, even as the language he spoke, lasso, bronco, rodeo, whispered his borrowed past. This cultural fusion wasn't always acknowledged, but it was everywhere. Mexican ranching expertise shaped the entire cattle economy of the West. The aesthetics of the Wild West weren't born in Texas. They were forged in the haciendas and deserts of northern Mexico. So the next time someone pictures a cowboy silhouetted against the setting sun, they should remember he might be speaking English, but his saddle tells a different story. And that saddle? It was often used to ride after some very specific cattle. 8. The Texas Longhorn, a hardy Spanish-descended breed, powered the great cattle drives north to railheads after the Civil War. The Texas Longhorn didn't care about barbed wire or blistering sun or snake-bitten prairie. It just kept walking. And thank God it did, because without it, the entire post-Civil War cattle boom might have never happened. This was a breed born for distance. Descended from the Spanish cattle brought over in the 1500s, the Longhorn was part wild, fully stubborn, and astonishingly durable. Long legs, high stamina, and horns that could stretch up to 7 feet from tip to tip. These were the four-legged engines of the cattle frontier. After the Civil War, Texas found itself overflowing with cattle and bankrupt on everything else. Beef was cheap in the South, but up north, it was gold on a plate. The solution was simple in theory and punishing in practice. Drive the cattle north, hundreds of miles, to railheads in Kansas. From there, they'd be shipped to Chicago, New York, and wherever else hunger paid. The Longhorn was perfect for this journey. It could survive on scrub, go days without water, and fend off predators with its horns and hooves. Trail bosses came to swear by them. By the late 1860s and into the 1870s, these drives became the backbone of Western cattle commerce. With every step, the Longhorn helped turn trail dust into cold, hard profit. But Longhorns weren't just meat. They were motion. They kept cowboys in the saddle, chuck wagons on the trail, and boom towns on the rise. When the cattle reached Dodge City or Abilene, money changed hands, tempers flared, and legends were born. Of course, a single cow was nothing. But 1,000 together? That was a living, snorting economy on the move. And they didn't move alone. They moved on memory, along trails now etched into the very dirt. 9. The Chisholm Trail, Goodnight Loving Trail, and Western Trail were highways of hooves, moving millions of cattle to Kansas and beyond. They called them trails, but they were more like scars, long winding arteries cut through prairie and scrub, driven by hoofbeats and held together by grit. The Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and the Western Trail, names now wrapped in romance. But at the time, they were just brutal, functional paths north. After the Civil War, as cattle flooded Texas and demand exploded in the east, the trails became economic lifelines. The Chisholm Trail, carved out in the late 1860s, ran from southern Texas to Abilene, Kansas, a direct artery to the Kansas Pacific Railroad. The Goodnight-Loving Trail veered west through dangerous Comanche territory into New Mexico and Colorado. The Western Trail, slightly later, pushed cattle even farther north toward Dodge City and beyond. These weren't peaceful highways. They were hard slogs of dust, storms, swollen rivers, and high-stakes navigation. The drives could stretch for months. Cowboys faced stampedes, lightning, quicksand, and boredom sharp enough to cut. But the payout, $30 a head in Kansas versus $4 in Texas, was worth the ordeal. The cattle weren't just merchandise. They were movement, a procession of life and noise and risk. Millions of them, actual millions, walked those trails. The land never forgot, and neither did the towns that waited at the trail's end. Kansas railheads became chaotic pressure valves where cowhands blew off steam. Saloons raked in gold, and local sheriffs aged faster than most. But the trails weren't permanent. Fences, quarantine laws, and overgrazing would eventually shutter them. For a brief window, though, they defined the West, and along the way, cowboys didn't just herd cattle. They built a portable, dusty civilization, complete with food, fire, and music under the stars, all centered around one humble innovation that turned a wagon into a kitchen with wheels. 10. Charles Goodnight's 1866 innovation, the chuck wagon, standardized trail kitchens, coffee, beans, bacon, sourdough, and peach cobbler on good days. It's easy to mythologize the cowboy as a lone figure against a vast horizon, but in reality, even the most rugged riders needed one thing above all: dinner. Enter the chuck wagon, a trail kitchen on wheels, invented by Charles Goodnight in 1866. The chuck wagon didn't just feed cowboys. It structured their days, settled their arguments, and, on rare good nights, offered the miracle of hot peach cobbler in the middle of nowhere. Goodnight, a former Texas Ranger turned cattleman, was no romantic. He was a logistics guy. Faced with feeding a dozen or more men over 1,000 miles of open range, he took a surplus army wagon and refitted it into something more essential than a firearm: a mobile galley. The back end opened into a fold-down table, and inside were shelves, drawers, and compartments. Every square inch filled with beans, bacon, coffee, flour, salt, and sometimes dried fruit if the pay was good and the morale was bad. Meals were simple, but not always bleak. Sourdough was guarded like a sacred object. The cook's starter was often older than the youngest hand. Biscuits could be fluffy or used as improvised ammo, depending on the cook's mood. Bacon came in slabs, beans in buckets, and coffee in boiling black kettles that rarely cooled. The cook, often just called Cookie, was the closest thing to a priest on the trail. His word was law. He got up before dawn and went to bed last. If he didn't like you, your portion got mysteriously smaller. If you messed with his chuck wagon, your life got mysteriously harder. But the chuck wagon wasn't just about meals. It was the social center. Gossip, fights, storytelling, and exhausted laughter all circled around its firelight. And under that same sky, another cowboy tradition thrived, this one a little more musical. 11. Night herders sang to calm the herd. A human voice kept skittish cattle from stampeding under the wheeling stars. It's one of the most quietly poetic images of the West. A lone cowboy riding the outer rim of a sleeping herd, singing into the dark. His voice drifting through the night, half lullaby, half insurance policy. This wasn't sentimentality. It was strategy. Cattle are nervous animals. A branch snapping, a coyote yipping, or a distant thunderclap could send hundreds of them into a blind, deadly stampede. The antidote? Human song. Cowboys called it night herding or night riding. The job wasn't glamorous. It meant long shifts under stars, usually in pairs, circling the herd slowly and singing to let the cattle know they weren't alone. Familiar voices calmed them. Repetition mattered. Many songs had a soft, droning quality, part chant, part melody, designed to echo across the open land without startling anything. The lyrics were often improvised, part hymn, part parody, part homesick ramble. Cowboys borrowed from church songs, Irish ballads, Mexican folk tunes, and invented verses on the fly. If it had a steady rhythm and didn't spook the steers, it was fair game. In a world that demanded toughness, this was one of the few sanctioned forms of vulnerability. No one mocked a night herder for singing. His voice might be the only thing standing between the camp and a 1,000-pound stampede at 2 a.m. The songs weren't recorded, they weren't preserved, most evaporated with the dew, but their legacy lingers in old cowboy ballads and Western soundtracks that still echo with that strange, soft mix of grit and melody. And yet, as peaceful as the scene seems, it existed only in a fragile balance, because the land was changing, fast. And soon, a simple, twisted invention would tear that balance apart, one strand of wire at a time. 12. Open-range ranching thrived on unfenced public domain until barbed wire, patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874, stitched the plains shut. For a time, the West was wide open, literally. Cattle grazed on public domain, unfenced and unmanaged, drifting wherever water and grass led them. Ranchers branded their stock and let them roam, trusting in territoriality and the unspoken codes of the trail. It was messy, inefficient, and often violent. But it worked. Then, in 1874, Joseph Glidden patented something deceptively simple, barbed wire, and the open range began to die. Glidden didn't invent the idea. He just perfected it. His design used twisted strands of wire and sharp barbs, spaced like punctuation marks in a legal argument. Cheap, easy to produce, and wildly effective. Barbed wire turned vast stretches of prairie into checkerboards of private property. 1 mile at a time, the West became less a wilderness and more a spreadsheet. The cattle barons loved it. Small ranchers hated it. Open-range grazing depended on shared access to water, grass, and migration routes. Barbed wire snapped that access shut, often literally overnight. Suddenly a rider might find a new fence where there'd been none the day before, cutting off his herd from the only nearby spring. Barbed wire became a weapon of ownership. It signaled that someone with money had drawn a line, and behind that line, the land stopped being wild and started being regulated. You couldn't ride forever anymore. You had to stop at the fence. And so the open range, once the canvas for every cowboy myth, was slowly hemmed in. The Great Plains, which had once seemed infinite, were measured, parceled, and fenced. The wire didn't just change geography, it changed psychology. It ended an era of movement and started one of boundaries. And then came the winter that proved once and for all that the open range was not only gone, it was no longer survivable. 13. The catastrophic winter of 1886 to 1887, the Big Die-Up, killed hundreds of thousands of cattle and ended the open range era. It came quietly at first. A colder than average fall, a few early snow flurries. Cowboys tightened their coats and said what cowboys always say, "It'll blow through," but it didn't. The winter of 1886 to 1887 settled in like a curse. And when it finally broke, the open range was broken with it. They called it the Big Die-Up, a bitterly ironic name for a slow-motion disaster. The season hit after a summer of drought that left the grass dry and sparse. Cattle went into winter already underfed. Then came blizzards. Not one or two, but a series of crushing whiteouts that buried the plains for months. Temperatures plunged to 30 below. Fences vanished under snowdrifts. Water sources froze solid. Cattle, driven by instinct, tried to drift south in search of food. But barbed wire, recently strung across millions of acres, trapped them in place. Herds piled against fences, lowing, starving, dying on their feet. Cowboys rode out in vain, only to find frozen carcasses stacked like driftwood. Estimates vary, but it's believed that hundreds of thousands of cattle perished that winter. Some say closer to 1 million. Ranchers lost entire herds. Fortunes vanished in a matter of weeks. Open-range ranching, as it had existed, was over, and it wasn't just nature's cruelty. The disaster revealed the fragility of a system that had pushed land, livestock, and labor past their limits. Overgrazing, overstocking, and blind faith in infinite prairie had left the cattle industry exposed. Nature simply delivered the final verdict. In the aftermath, survivors turned to fenced pastures, hay feeding, and smaller, managed herds. The romantic image of the wild, wandering cowboy gave way to something more practical and less poetic, but not everyone accepted fences quietly. Some fought back, with wire cutters and rage. 14. Fence-cutting wars erupted in the 1880s when small ranchers and cowboys clipped barbed wire to reach water and grass. By the 1880s, barbed wire wasn't just a tool, it was a dividing line between power and survival. The great fence-cutting wars didn't begin in Washington boardrooms or dusty saloons. They began on the dry edges of ranch land, where a desperate cowboy found a fence between his herd and the only water for miles, and decided to solve the problem with pliers. In Texas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, tensions boiled over. Large cattle companies had fenced off millions of acres, some of it public land, some questionably acquired, some outright stolen. Smaller ranchers, farmers, and cowboys, many of them newly arrived homesteaders, saw their access to grazing land, water, and traditional cattle trails suddenly vanish behind twisted steel. So they cut. Under cover of night or broad daylight, riders moved down fence lines like reapers, slicing through miles of wire. In some areas, entire crews were hired just to cut. Landowners responded in kind, hiring guards, filing lawsuits, and occasionally returning fire. The conflict wasn't organized, but it was deeply personal. For many, it wasn't just about grass. It was about who got to define the West. In 1884, Texas passed the fence-cutting law, making it a felony to cut wire. That did little to stop the practice, and in some cases only escalated tensions. Violence flared, buildings burned, at least a few people died, though official records tend to downplay the count. But by the end of the decade, the writing was on the wall, and the fences. Technology and capital had won. Open land became private. Access turned into permission. And the old cowboy ideal of free-range justice began its slow fade. Still, even as the West was fenced, it wasn't fully tamed. Not when some towns had stricter gun laws than we do now. 15. Towns like Dodge City and Tombstone posted no firearms in town ordinances. Frontier gun control was common in cattle hubs. Contrary to popular myth, the Wild West wasn't an endless shootout waiting to happen. In fact, some of the most iconic frontier towns, Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, had stricter gun laws than many modern cities. In cattle towns, the first thing you often saw wasn't a saloon, it was a sign. No firearms within city limits. Why? Simple. Money. These towns existed to extract cash from cattle drives. When drovers flooded in with pockets full of beef money, saloons, gambling halls, and brothels geared up for profit. The last thing local officials wanted was a drunken shootout cutting into business or, worse, scaring off investors. So they enacted ordinances requiring all visitors to check their guns at the edge of town, usually at the sheriff's office or a designated gun club. And these weren't suggestions. In Tombstone, the very law that led to the infamous OK Corral shootout was a gun control ordinance. Virgil Earp, as city marshal, tried to enforce it. The Clantons refused. What followed was 30 seconds of gunfire, a dozen years of lawsuits, and a century of cinematic exaggeration. Even in Dodge City, the so-called Queen of the Cowtowns, Lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson weren't just gunslingers. They were rule enforcers. They managed saloons, enforced curfews, and yes, took your gun at the city line. The image of the armed-to-the-teeth cowboy swaggering into town is more myth than memory. In truth, the Wild West was obsessed with order, because the stakes were high, the margins thin, and the consequences immediate. It's ironic, isn't it? The land most associated with lawlessness was, in its most profitable pockets, deeply invested in law. Of course, 30 seconds of violence was enough to become legend, especially when myth writers got hold of it. 16. The famous 1881 OK Corral shootout lasted about 30 seconds. Legend multiplied those seconds into an epic. The most iconic gunfight in the West? It lasted half a minute. 30 frantic seconds. Fewer than 30 bullets fired, and yet somehow, those 30 seconds stretched into 150 years of retellings, reenactments, and righteous monologues. The gunfight at the OK Corral, which, to be technically correct, didn't even happen at the corral itself, was the product of legal gray zones, political rivalry, personal insults, and a little too much pride. On one side, the Earp brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, plus their loyal and trigger-happy friend Doc Holliday. On the other, Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and a volatile mix of resentments that had been simmering for months. The core issue? Guns. More specifically, Tombstone's ordinance banning the carrying of firearms in town. The cowboys, capital C, refused to disarm. The Earps, representing what passed for law and order, decided to enforce the rule. The confrontation took place in a vacant lot behind the OK Corral, not in the corral itself. Small detail, but myth rarely gets the address right. The gunfight was short, chaotic, and deadly. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys were dead, Virgil and Morgan were wounded, and Doc Holliday was still standing, barely and full of spite. But what happened next is more interesting. The shootout didn't settle anything. It ignited feuds, trials, and ambushes. The Earps went from lawmen to avengers. Tombstone itself began to fade soon after, its mines tapped, its population drifting. But the myth had legs. Dime novels, traveling shows, and eventually Hollywood would replay the 30 seconds again and again, each version more dramatic than the last. The real gunfight was over fast. The imaginary one never ended, and while the OK Corral got all the attention, another Peace Commission photo op tried to sell a more civilized story of law and order. The camera, however, wasn't fooled. 17. The Dodge City Peace Commission of 1883 was a photo op truce among gun-toting lawmen trying to calm a boomtown's image. If you've seen the photograph, you know the look. 9 stern-faced men in suits seated and standing in a stiff, formal pose, each one armed and unsmiling. It's called the Dodge City Peace Commission, but the peace was more public relations than resolution. By 1883, Dodge City, Kansas had developed a reputation that even Dodge City wasn't proud of. Drunken brawls, saloon shootouts, gambling scandals. It was the boomtown equivalent of bad Yelp reviews. The cattle trade brought cash, chaos, and cowboys with more attitude than sobriety. Local businessmen, fearing the town's brand was becoming too tarnished to attract investment, decided to stage a truce. The backstory is classic frontier drama. Lawman Luke Short, part-time gambler and full-time gunfighter, had been forced out of town by rival factions. He returned with support from an all-star lineup of Western legends: Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and other famous shootists. Tensions rose. A potential gunfight loomed. But rather than let Dodge explode again, cooler heads saw an opportunity, not for justice, but for marketing. The factions gathered, smiled as best they could, and posed for a photo titled Peace Commission. It was circulated widely, proof that Dodge was now safe, civilized, and open for business. The reality? These were the same men who had built their reputations in smoke and blood. Their version of peace came with holsters. But the picture worked. Dodge's worst days were behind it. The cattle trade was shifting, and the town would soon pivot towards something quieter. Still, the photo lingers. 9 men trying to look respectable, failing just enough to be legendary. It's not history. It's branding. And if branding was how you preserved your legacy, death offered its own brutal kind of punctuation mark, one that came with a pair of boots still on your feet. 18. Boot Hill cemeteries took their name from those who died with their boots on, a euphemism for violent death. Every frontier town had one, a patch of ground on the edge of civilization, where the soil was rocky, the graves were shallow, and the names were often carved in haste. Boot Hill wasn't a single cemetery. It was a cultural shorthand. It meant someone had died suddenly, violently, and usually in public. The phrase, died with their boots on, wasn't metaphor. It meant they hadn't been expecting to die, weren't in bed, weren't sick, weren't old. They were shot, stabbed, trampled, or hung before the day's chores were done. Often they were still wearing the same boots they'd walked into town with. Towns like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood each had their own boot hill, and each was crowded. Some markers bore names, others just dates. A few had epitaphs, often humorous or vengeful. He called Bill Smith a liar, or, I told you I was sick. Most had nothing. Just boots in the dirt and rumors overhead. What made Boot Hill legendary wasn't the dead. It was what the living said about them. In the absence of justice, burial became theater. Local papers might embellish a feud. Dime novelists would elevate a petty crook into a misunderstood anti-hero. And tourists, even in the late 19th century, started arriving just to gawk. It was the final resting place for legends in the making, or for nameless victims of a town's growing pains. In many cases, the line between criminal and lawman was blurry enough that both ended up under the same soil. Boot Hill wasn't about peace. It was about punctuation. A way for the West to say, this story ends here. And inside the saloons where many of those final chapters began, a different kind of gamble played out. Not with guns, but with cards. 19. Pharaoh, not poker, was the most popular saloon card game. Gamblers called it bucking the tiger. Forget poker. If you wanted to blend into the velvet haze of a Western saloon in the 1870s, you didn't call for aces and eights. You played Pharaoh. Known as bucking the tiger, this was the king of the gambling hall long before the cinematic myths of poker hands and suspicious eyes took over. It was fast-paced, easy to learn, and, most importantly, felt like you might win. Pharaoh was a French import, but it found its true home in the American West. With a simple setup, a layout board, a deck of cards, and a banker who controlled the game, it attracted crowds from all walks of life. Unlike poker, Pharaoh wasn't about bluffing or reading your opponents. It was more like betting on horses or dice, with a faint air of legitimacy and a heavy scent of whiskey. Saloon owners loved it because it kept people playing. The rounds were quick. The bets small at first, then catastrophically bold. The house had an edge, but only if the dealer didn't cheat, and many did. Marked decks, stacked shuffles, and sleight of hand weren't the exception. They were part of the unspoken rules. The honest Pharaoh dealer was as mythical as the noble outlaw. And the nickname Bucking the Tiger? That came from the stylized tiger head often painted on Pharaoh tables and saloon signs. To play the game was to challenge the beast. Fast, dangerous, and usually fatal to your wallet. The phrase stuck. Buck the tiger and lost was frontier slang for any unlucky bet. Poker would rise later thanks to its drama and cinematic flair. But Pharaoh was the game that built saloons, ruined fortunes, and kept the night alive long after the law had gone to bed. And if you played long enough, the drinks would flow. After all, nothing pairs with losing like a little salted generosity. 20. Saloons popularized the free lunch, salted food that made you buy more drinks to wash it down. Free lunch might be the most successful lie ever printed on a saloon sign. Walk through the swinging doors of a Western drinking hall and you'd often find a spread of cold cuts, bread, cheese, pickles, and salted meats laid out like an invitation, all free for anyone who ordered a drink. What they didn't tell you? That drink came with a hidden surcharge: thirst. The genius of the free lunch wasn't generosity, it was chemistry. Saloon keepers knew that salty food made patrons drink more, stay longer, and spend far beyond the cost of the lukewarm ham and stale rye bread. It was the 19th century version of psychological marketing, and it worked beautifully. The trick was balance. If the food was too good, the saloon took a hit. Too bad, and no one stayed. The goal was mediocrity wrapped in aroma. Patrons would drift in, order a nickel beer, and nibble on sardines or pickled eggs. Then, somewhere between the third cracker and the fourth pretzel, they'd realize their glass was empty and their mouth dry. Another beer, then another. By the fifth round, the lunch wasn't so free anymore. Free lunch counters also became social hubs. Cowboys rubbed shoulders with gamblers, miners with clerks. Deals were made, gossip traded, and reputations destroyed over a plate of salted pork and a pint of beer. In some towns, the spread got competitive. One saloon would add hot soup, another would roast a turkey, until someone cried foul and reminded everyone, this was supposed to be bait, not a buffet. And yet the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch, has its roots in this exact Western custom, a clever way to turn hunger into habit. And while the free lunch kept mouths full and money flowing, another Western industry was feeding something much bigger: the national appetite for heroes. 21st. Dime novels mass-manufactured heroes and villains, turning working lawmen like Hickok and Earp into larger-than-life brands. Before Hollywood took a single frame, before radio spun its first saddle-bound tale, the Wild West's myths were already rolling off printing presses by the ton. The dime novel was the 19th century's version of viral media, cheap, addictive, and only loosely attached to reality. These books were small, flimsy, and sold for 10 cents, a bargain for readers hungry for adventure and drama. Titles like Deadwood Dick, Buffalo Bill, King of the Bordermen, and Wild Bill's Last Shot filled the shelves of general stores and the pockets of restless teenagers. In towns with no theater and few newspapers, dime novels offered something irresistible: a fantasy of freedom, violence, and uncomplicated justice. The real-life figures weren't nearly as exciting. Wild Bill Hickok spent more time gambling than gunning. Wyatt Earp was, at various times, a lawman, a con man, and a saloon keeper. But in the pages of the dime novel, they became immortal gunfighters, tamers of chaos, protectors of women and whiskey. Writers didn't bother with research. Why would they? Truth didn't sell, so they embellished, invented, plagiarized, and rebranded. Villains became monstrous. Heroes never missed. Dialogue was stilted, and plots were recycled endlessly, but the effect was powerful. These stories built the West in the public imagination, even as the real West was being fenced, paved, and subdivided. Ironically, many of the men who became famous through dime novels didn't live to enjoy it or hated the way they were portrayed. But their stories were already bigger than them. They were no longer people. They were brands. And one of those brands, perhaps the biggest, would take his own story on tour, turning fiction into theater and bringing the Wild West to the world. 22. Buffalo Bill Cody's Traveling Wild West, launched 1883, exported the West to the world, complete with Lakota performers and sharpshooters. By the 1880s, the real West was getting fenced in, surveyed, litigated, and photographed. So Buffalo Bill Cody, with a keen eye for drama and a marketer's soul, did something brilliant. He put the Wild West on stage, then took it on the road. His creation, launched in 1883, was part rodeo, part reenactment, part moral play, and entirely myth. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show wasn't a circus, though it often parked next to one. It was a theatrical spectacle, a curated version of frontier life, complete with gunfights, galloping horses, stagecoach holdups, and symbolic battles between settlers and native warriors. Cody knew his audience. They wanted adventure, redemption, and a clear good guy. He gave them that, framed in flags and backed by booming brass bands. The show was diverse in its own contradictory way. Lakota performers, including actual veterans of the Indian Wars like Sitting Bull, were featured prominently, playing themselves, but in choreographed battles designed to lose. The irony of former adversaries now reenacting their defeats for applause wasn't lost on anyone, but neither was the paycheck. For many native performers, the Wild West show offered steady income and global travel at a time when reservation life offered little. Annie Oakley, the sharpshooting sensation, was another star, able to split playing cards with a rifle from horseback. The cast included cowboys, Mexicans, cavalrymen, and an occasional celebrity cameo. The backdrop was a stylized prairie. The message? American expansion was thrilling, righteous, and complete. The show toured not just across the United States, but across Europe, where foreign audiences devoured the imagery. Queen Victoria reportedly loved it. So did the crowds in Paris, Berlin, and Rome. It was the Wild West, packaged and portable, and while the show was theater, the skill was real, especially when it came to its greatest female performer, whose aim never wavered. 23. Annie Oakley's rock-steady marksmanship helped make women firearms icons on the show circuit, not just in camp or cabin. When Annie Oakley stepped onto the arena floor, crowds held their breath, and then she'd shoot the ashes off a cigarette, split a playing card edgewise, or hit a moving dime in midair. They called her Little Sure Shot, and the name was well earned. She didn't just perform, she redefined what a woman could be on the American frontier and in American entertainment. Born Phoebe Ann Mosey in Ohio, Annie grew up poor, took up shooting to feed her family, and was a marksman by her teens. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885, and almost overnight became a legend. Her petite frame, Victorian modesty, and precise dead-eye accuracy created a fascinating contrast. She wasn't just skilled, she was stylized. Part girl next door, part one-woman artillery unit. Oakley wasn't the only woman with a rifle in the West, of course. Women hunted, defended homesteads, and joined in frontier labor as needed. But Annie took that competence and turned it into performance art. On stage, she made shooting elegant, almost poetic. She performed trick shots on horseback, hit distant targets while standing backward, and even let her husband, Frank Butler, hold items in his mouth while she aimed. Her fame transcended the West itself. She toured Europe, outshot male competitors in exhibitions, and even offered to raise and lead a regiment of sharpshooting women during the Spanish-American War. The War Department declined. History still hasn't recovered from the missed opportunity. Oakley's image was both weaponized and idealized. A woman who could fire like a soldier but pose like a lady. She wasn't a contradiction, she was a correction. And she paved the way for generations of women in sport, performance, and myth. Even her wardrobe, modest skirts, tailored jackets, stood out against the grit of the trail. But for the men who worked the trail, another piece of gear became legendary in its own right, though it started out as purely utilitarian. 24. Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis patented riveted work pants in 1873. Denim waist overalls, jeans, were built for miners and cowboys. They weren't trying to start a fashion revolution. They were just trying to keep pants from falling apart. In 1873, dry goods merchant Levi Strauss and tailor Jacob Davis patented a deceptively simple idea. Rivets, tiny metal fasteners at points of stress in work pants. The result? A garment that could survive the West. Not stylish, not sleek, just tough. The original design wasn't called jeans. It was waist overalls, made of heavy-duty denim or duck cloth, with a button fly, a cinch in the back, and those now iconic copper rivets. Davis had been sewing them for miners in Nevada who kept blowing through the seams of their pants. He wrote to Strauss in San Francisco, proposing a business partnership. Strauss saw the potential and filed the patent. From the beginning, they were workwear, built for the hardest jobs in the harshest places. Miners, railroad men, and eventually cowboys all wore them. The fabric held up against thorns, friction, weather, and whatever your horse threw at you. In the dust of cattle drives or the damp of gold tunnels, Levi's became unofficial uniforms. The jeans adapted quickly. When pockets tore, they were riveted. When the fly sagged, buttons were reinforced. Branding came later, first with a simple label, then with the now famous leather patch showing two horses trying to pull the jeans apart. What made them spread wasn't marketing, it was necessity. In a world where shirts ripped, boots leaked, and saddles broke, a pair of pants that held together was a minor miracle. Later, they'd become symbols of rebellion, of Americana, of cool. But in the Wild West, they were just clothes that worked. And work was what defined the West, especially when it involved panning through rivers or blowing up hillsides in pursuit of one flicker of gold. 25. The 49ers of California were mostly placer miners with pans. Industrial hydraulic mining later chewed entire hillsides into slurry. The image is simple, almost romantic. A solitary man, knee-deep in a cold California creek, swirling a tin pan in search of gold. That was placer mining, the entry-level game of the 1849 gold rush. And it's what most of the original 49ers actually did. No machines, no tunnels, just a pan, a shovel, and raw optimism. These early miners worked surface deposits, placer gold that had eroded out of rock and settled in riverbeds over centuries. It didn't take much to get started. A pan, a cradle, maybe a sluice box if you were fancy. Camps popped up overnight. So did shops, saloons, and claim disputes. Gold was luck, not strategy, and luck was a terrible long-term business plan. But the gold rush matured fast. Within a few years, the easy gold was mostly gone, and the real money shifted from prospectors to companies. That's when hydraulic mining entered the scene, armed with gravity and ambition. Miners built high-pressure water systems that blasted entire hillsides with jets of water. These cannons, called monitors, chewed through rock and soil, sending massive amounts of debris through sluices to catch any fleck of gold. It worked. For a while. It also caused environmental chaos. Rivers clogged with sediment. Farmland flooded with waste. Towns downstream turned into mudflats. Lawsuits followed. By the late 1880s, hydraulic mining was heavily restricted in California, but the damage lingered. Still, it left a legacy. The shift from individual miner to industrial extraction, a theme that would repeat across the West. The myth of the lone gold seeker would remain, but the real gold, like everything else, would end up in the hands of those who could afford to move mountains. And it wasn't just gold that got the treatment. A discovery in Nevada would prove that silver could rewrite the map just as quickly. 26. The Comstock Lode, Nevada, 1859, proved silver could mint new cities. Virginia City went from sagebrush to opera house in years. In 1859, a pair of luckless prospectors stumbled upon something heavy near the eastern slope of Nevada's Sierra Nevada mountains. They thought it was a nuisance. Nasty, blue-gray muck clogging their gold pans. That muck turned out to be rich silver ore. And the world would soon know it as the Comstock Lode. Almost overnight, Virginia City rose from barren scrub to industrial boomtown. What had been sagebrush and silence became one of the most sophisticated cities in the West. There were telegraph lines, gas lights, and yes, an opera house where miners in muddy boots might sit beside top-hatted investors. The scale was staggering. Miles of underground tunnels spiraled beneath the city. Square-set timbering, a mining innovation, was developed here just to keep the ceilings from collapsing. The silver flowed, and so did capital. Fortunes were made and vaporized within months. stock manipulation, insider deals, and speculative bubbles were daily fare. It wasn't just mining, it was financial theater. But the silver didn't just enrich mine owners. It funded public schools, railroads, and even helped stabilize U.S. currency during the Civil War. The Comstock became a national asset, not just a regional phenomenon. And with it came the usual westward accompaniments: saloons, brothels, gambling halls, and journalists writing myth as fast as the oar was pulled. At its height, Virginia City housed over 25,000 people, engineers, entertainers, and grifters alike. But like all boom towns, it was built on a ticking clock. When the veins thinned, the crowds dispersed. By the 1880s, much of the luster had faded. Still, for a while, silver reigned. And just a few years later, another metal would pull people into lands even more contested, where treaties were fragile and gold was the devil's invitation. 27. Black Hills Gold, 1874 to 76, drew miners into treaty lands, fueling conflict that included the Little Bighorn Campaign. The Black Hills weren't just sacred, they were promised. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty granted the land, now in South Dakota, to the Lakota Sioux, ensuring them control of the hills in perpetuity. Perpetuity, of course, lasted until gold was discovered. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led a U.S. expedition into the Black Hills, officially to scout a location for a new fort. Unofficially, he was sniffing for gold. He found it, or at least said he did, and the news spread like wildfire. By 1875, thousands of miners poured into the hills, despite the treaty's very clear language. The government didn't stop them. In fact, it quietly prepared for the next chapter, war. The Black Hills gold rush wasn't the biggest, but it was among the most inflammatory. Towns like Deadwood sprang up in direct violation of treaty law. The Lakota, already under pressure from broken agreements elsewhere, pushed back. What followed was the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 77, including the most infamous clash of all, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was a direct result of the gold rush, the treaties, and the government's decision to favor extraction over obligation. When Custer and his 7th Cavalry rode in to enforce a policy of containment, they were met by a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Custer didn't return, but gold still won. The Black Hills were never given back, despite decades of legal battles that continue to this day. The gold rush rewrote not just geography, but history, turning sacred ground into contested spoil. And in the gold camps that followed, people wrote their own laws, etched into dusty notebooks and enforced with pickaxes. 28. Mining camps wrote their own codes, limits on claim size, rules for recording, and penalties for claim jumping. The law was always late to the goldfields. Miners didn't wait. In the rough, ungoverned corners of the West, where courts were distant fantasies and sheriffs were either broke or non-existent, miners made their own rules. They called them mining codes, and they were as much survival strategy as social contract. Each camp drafted its own code, handwritten, voted on, and posted in the most public building available, usually a saloon. The rules varied, but most followed similar patterns: how big a claim could be, how it had to be marked, how often it needed to be worked to stay valid. There were time limits on filing, expectations on labor, and, most famously, stiff penalties for claim jumping. The unforgivable sin of stealing another man's dirt. Enforcement was communal. If someone was caught violating the code, the camp handled it. Sometimes that meant fines. Sometimes it meant physical eviction. Occasionally it meant rope and a sudden drop, but more often the threat was enough. No one wanted chaos. Gold was already unpredictable. The codes were a way to keep the powder dry, the shovels swinging, and the town from turning into a murder statistic. What's remarkable is how sophisticated some of these codes were. They kept logs, elected recorders, and held formal meetings. In many ways, they were grassroots legal systems, born not from ideology but from necessity. If you wanted order in a canyon full of strangers chasing fortune, you had to build it from scratch. These camp codes later influenced territorial laws and even state statutes. The West wasn't lawless, it was pre-law, and it was inventing itself as fast as the gold panned out. And when the gold did vanish, as it always did, the law and the miners packed up. But the towns they left behind? They didn't just fade, they crumbled. 29. Boom towns could turn to ghost towns in a season. When the ore pinched out, so did the people. Western boom towns didn't grow, they erupted. A rich strike of gold or silver could turn a nameless patch of desert into a humming city in under a month. Tents gave way to timber. Saloons outnumbered churches 5-1. General stores sprouted, gambling halls filled, and newspapers launched before the first schoolhouse was even framed. But just as quickly as they rose, they fell. All it took was one bad winter, one failed shaft, or one overhyped vein that ran dry. The moment the ore pinched out, the people did too, leaving behind empty buildings, broken dreams, and half-finished civic plans. Some ghost towns were total vanishings, nothing left but wind and warped wood. Others shrank down to skeleton populations, a few dozen holdouts clinging to memory or habit. Mines were abandoned mid-dig. Hotels stood fully furnished but empty. The piano in the saloon collected dust. The preacher's pulpit stood witness to no one. And yet, the ruins had their own strange allure. Tourists wandered through crumbling streets, poking into rusted stoves and leaning outhouses. Stories lingered like echoes: gunfights, gold strikes, fires that left nothing but brick chimneys. Ghost towns became time capsules. A few, like Bodie in California, were preserved intentionally. Arrested decay, they called it. Others simply refused to die, surviving on seasonal trickles of tourism or stubborn retirees with a taste for quiet. The life cycle was always fast: discovery, flood, frenzy, collapse. In some cases, the town never even got a name before it was abandoned. Just a dot on an old survey map. But not everyone in those towns was there for gold. Many provided services, essential or otherwise, to the ones who were. And in a twist, the prospectors didn't see coming. Those folks often made more money. 30. Assayers, freighters, blacksmiths, carpenters, and laundries often made steadier money than the men chasing glitter in the pan. The romantic figure of the lone prospector, dirty boots in the creek, pans swirling under the morning sun, that's who gets the spotlight. But while he was dreaming of striking it rich, someone else was already getting paid. The people who sold him his gear, fixed his tools, mended his clothes, and told him where to dig. Assayers, those cool-eyed chemists with scales and acids, held real power. They could turn a pile of shiny flakes into a verified claim, or dismiss a month's work with a shrug. For a fee, of course. Miners waited anxiously as these quiet men dropped acid onto samples and watched for the right reaction. One blink meant a fortune. Another meant fool's gold. Then there were the freighters, driving ox-drawn wagons over impossible terrain, delivering everything from flour to dynamite. Their routes were dangerous, slow, and often miserable, but they got paid regardless of whether the mine boomed or busted. Blacksmiths were essential. Picks dulled, horses lost shoes, equipment broke. Without a smithy, a camp became a waiting room. Carpenters, too, were in constant demand, erecting buildings, shoring up mine shafts, building sluices and flumes. Their work didn't glitter, but it paid. And then there were the laundries, often run by Chinese immigrants, women, or enterprising couples. In towns where men outnumbered women 10-1 and soap was a luxury, clean clothes weren't just comfort, they were commerce. A fresh shirt could mean the difference between being taken seriously at the assayer's office or not. Ironically, those chasing gold often ended up broke. The ones who supported them, quietly, consistently, often left with actual money. The West rewarded persistence more than luck, but most people didn't figure that out until their second busted claim. And for many of those hard workers, the fight wasn't just for prosperity, it was for place, especially when the welcome mat was yanked out from under them. 31. Chinese immigrants built railroads, ran laundries, cooked in camps, and mined. They also faced boycotts, riots, and exclusion laws. The story of the American West often forgets the hands that built its backbone. Among them were Chinese immigrants, whose labor, cheap, skilled, and relentless, laid down tracks, filled bellies, and kept entire camps functional. They weren't just helpers. They were the infrastructure. On the Central Pacific Railroad, thousands of Chinese workers blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, working in brutal conditions for lower wages than their white counterparts. They did the most dangerous jobs, handling explosives, scaling cliffs, and kept the project moving when others quit. Once the tracks were down, many turned to other work, opening laundries, working as camp cooks, or mining played-out claims others had abandoned. But even as they contributed to the very shape of the West, they were treated as outsiders. In cities and camps, Chinese communities became targets for boycotts and riots. White laborers accused them of stealing jobs, conveniently forgetting that no one else had wanted those jobs in the first place. Violence flared, laws followed. At every level, anti-Chinese sentiment was baked into policy. Local ordinances banned them from owning land. State laws targeted their businesses. And eventually the federal government stepped in with something unprecedented, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It was the first major U.S. law to bar immigration based explicitly on race or nationality. And yet the Chinese presence persisted. In towns across California, Oregon, Idaho, and beyond, Chinatowns emerged, dense, resilient, and often self-contained. There was beauty in them. Paper lanterns, herbal apothecaries, festivals with fireworks and dragons. But the walls weren't just cultural, they were defensive. The West promised opportunity, but it offered it selectively. For Chinese immigrants, every dollar earned came with a warning. You could build this country, but you might never belong to it. And they weren't the only ones whose land, rights, and identity were rewritten by borders that didn't ask permission. 32. The Page Act, 1875, and Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, were the first major U.S. restrictions on immigration, rooted in Western tensions. Immigration laws don't begin with Ellis Island or anxious paperwork. They begin with fear, usually economic, occasionally moral, often racial. And in the American West, that fear crystallized into law long before the Statue of Liberty raised her torch. The Page Act of 1875 was the federal government's first real step into immigration restriction. It didn't ban all Chinese immigrants, but it specifically barred women, especially those accused, often without evidence, of arriving for immoral purposes. It was framed as a moral safeguard. In practice, it was a blunt tool of exclusion, aimed at breaking apart Chinese family formation and discouraging long-term settlement. But the big one came 7 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It banned nearly all immigration from China for 10 years, renewed later, barred Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens, and codified the idea that some nationalities were inherently undesirable. It wasn't just about jobs, it was about control. In the West, where Chinese labor had built railroads and serviced mining camps, economic downturns fueled resentment. When gold dried up and wages shrank, mobs went looking for scapegoats. Politicians listened, not to reason, but to angry crowds. The result was national policy shaped by local prejudice. The Exclusion Act marked a turning point. It proved that the federal government was willing to draw racial lines into the immigration system. It created a blueprint, one that would be expanded and refined over the decades. It also split families, stranded workers, and froze entire communities in limbo. Chinatowns became more isolated, their residents subject to surveillance, suspicion, and arbitrary deportation. This wasn't just legislation, it was narrative control. It said who counted and who didn't. And even older communities, ones that had lived in the West for generations, were about to learn that treaties didn't guarantee anything. 33. Mexican and Hispano communities predated U.S. conquest. Spanish and Mexican land grants shaped property fights for decades. Long before English-speaking settlers showed up with maps and railroads, the American West was home to Mexican and Hispano communities, descendants of Spanish colonists, native peoples, and Mexican citizens. They built missions, raised cattle, ran acequia irrigation systems, and claimed vast stretches of land under Spanish and Mexican land grants. When the U.S. took the Southwest after the Mexican-American War in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to honor those existing land rights. On paper, it was a peaceful transition. On the ground, it was anything but. The land grants became legal battlegrounds. American courts, often hostile, frequently corrupt, demanded documents, surveys, and titles that were either written in Spanish, lost in fires, or dismissed as insufficient. Many Hispano families who had held ranchos for generations found themselves tangled in litigation or priced out by legal fees and squatters. New arrivals saw open land. The original residents saw something being erased. Tensions mounted. In New Mexico, groups like Las Gorras Blancas, the Whitecaps, took up tools, and sometimes sabotage, to defend communal lands. They cut fences, burned barns, and protested railroads that cut through old settlements. Their message was clear. We were here before you. We don't vanish on command. In places like California and Texas, property disputes became more than legal quibbles. They were cultural battlegrounds, shaping racial hierarchies that would persist for generations. Spanish surnames became identifiers in court, in business, in school. Displacement wasn't just economic. It was political, linguistic, and architectural. Yet the cultural imprint endured. Place names, foodways, laws, and land use patterns still echo the original inhabitants' influence. The West was never blank, just overwritten. And as settlers redrew the map, even marriage laws had to reckon with the traditions already in place, some of which proved surprisingly resilient. 34. Community property laws from Spanish tradition entered state legal systems like California's, unusual for the wider U.S. When the U.S. absorbed the Southwest, it also absorbed something most Americans weren't expecting: Spanish civil law. That included a legal concept that, at the time, struck many Easterners as shockingly progressive: community property. Under Spanish and Mexican legal tradition, married couples shared ownership of most property acquired during the marriage. Land, cattle, income, it all belonged equally to both spouses. This meant that wives had legal claims to wealth, land titles, and inheritance, in ways that sharply contrasted with English common law, where women's property often defaulted to their husbands. California, upon joining the Union in 1850, retained many of these Spanish legal structures, at least on paper. Community property became part of the state's official law, influencing how land was owned, divided, and passed on. Texas, New Mexico, and a few other western states followed similar patterns. For many Anglo-American settlers, this was baffling. The idea that a woman could own half a ranch, even if her name wasn't on the deed, clashed with prevailing gender norms. And yet, it persisted, especially in areas with strong Hispano or Mexican cultural continuity. Over time, the legal influence of community property reshaped expectations around divorce settlements, inheritance, and women's economic rights in the West. It offered a small but significant pocket of autonomy for frontier women, particularly compared to their counterparts back east. This quiet legal carryover didn't make headlines, but it shaped daily life. It was part of the West's strange legal mosaic, part Anglo, part Spanish, part survivalism. In a region defined by flux, The law itself was a layered thing, less about ideology, more about whatever got the job done. And for many newly freed Americans after the Civil War, owning land, any land, meant freedom, which is exactly why they followed the wind toward Kansas. 35. African American Exodusters migrated to Kansas around 1879, founding towns and farming on the plains. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, thousands of African Americans in the South faced a familiar set of threats: economic hardship, racial violence, and the constant threat of being pushed off whatever ground they tried to call home. In response, many packed their lives into wagons, walked away from the ashes, and headed west, specifically to Kansas. They called themselves Exodusters. The name was no accident. It echoed the biblical Exodus, and they saw themselves the same way: a people fleeing bondage in search of a promised land. The destination wasn't just geographic. It was symbolic. Kansas had been a free state, a battleground for abolition, and in the Exodusters' minds, it represented something close to sanctuary. Starting in 1879, waves of African American migrants moved into the Great Plains. They founded towns like Nicodemus, where formerly enslaved people and their descendants built homes, planted crops, and tried to prove that they too could thrive in the American dream, if given a scrap of land and a sliver of peace. The land was harsh, the weather unforgiving. Farming on the plains required tools, animals, seed, and luck, not all of which the Exodusters had. Many were poor, relying on pooled resources and church networks. But they also carried something stronger: community, faith, and stubborn hope. White neighbors were not always welcoming. Discrimination followed them, even into territories that had once flown the banner of freedom. But still, the Exodusters persisted. Their towns became centers of black political life, education, and resistance. A quiet defiance against a country that hadn't yet decided if they fully counted. Their story isn't always front and center in the Western mythos, but it should be. They weren't just passengers on the wagon trail. They were builders. And among the builders of the West, one group stood out for their sheer numbers and invisibility. 36. An estimated 1 in 4 cowboys were black. Many others were Mexican or native. Trail crews were multi-ethnic workplaces. Forget the Hollywood casting. The actual cattle trails of the American West looked nothing like a John Wayne movie. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys during the post-Civil War era were African American. Add in Mexican vaqueros and Native American hands, and the reality becomes clear. The cattle economy wasn't just multicultural, it was built on it. After the Civil War, many formerly enslaved men headed west, seeking something the South had denied them: mobility, wages, and a shred of autonomy. The open range didn't promise equality, but it offered space, literal and social, to carve out a living. Cattle outfits needed labor, and trail bosses cared more about your ability to ride, rope, and endure than the color of your skin. Trail crews were often multi-ethnic teams who rode together for months, sleeping under stars and sharing everything from coffee to danger. Hierarchies existed. Racism didn't vanish at the border. But on the trail, competence meant survival. If you couldn't do the job, you weren't invited back. Black cowboys like Bose Icard, who rode with Charles Goodnight, and Nat Love, a former slave-turned-skilled rider and crack shot, became minor legends, though the world was slow to remember them. Many more names were never recorded. The same goes for Mexican vaqueros, whose influence shaped everything from gear to technique, and native cowboys, some of whom worked reservation lands or rode for ranchers bordering tribal areas. The romantic image of the lone white cowboy, it was manufactured, not remembered. The real West was loud, dusty, and diverse, more complex than the myths it left behind. And when those cowboys needed backup, it often came from a very different kind of lawman. one wearing a badge that covered thousands of square miles. 37. The U.S. Marshal Service patrolled enormous territories. Deputy marshals like Bass Reeves rode thousands of miles wrangling fugitives. If you wanted to vanish in the Old West, there were plenty of places to do it. What was harder, much harder, was tracking someone down across thousands of miles of lawless territory. That's where the U.S. Marshal Service came in. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't even safe. But it was essential. Unlike town sheriffs whose jurisdiction might end at the saloon door, U.S. Marshals enforced federal law across vast stretches of the frontier, particularly in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, where outlaws' new jurisdiction was blurry and deputies were scarce. The territories didn't have state governments yet. They had chaos, and the marshals were the buffer. Among them was Bass Reeves, a formerly enslaved man turned lawman who remains one of the most formidable and overlooked figures in Western history. Fluent in multiple languages, including native dialects, a master horseman, and a crack shot, Reeves arrested over 3,000 fugitives during his career. Some he brought in alive, some not. Legend has it he was never shot, though his hat and belt weren't as lucky. Deputy marshals like Reeves often rode alone, armed with a warrant and a badge and not much else. There were no radios, no reinforcements, just instinct, tracking skills, and the kind of stubborn commitment that made the difference between justice and a cold trail. And the price was high. Between 1872 and 1896, more than 100 deputy U.S. Marshals were killed in Indian Territory alone. The badge offered little protection against ambushes or politics, yet for all their grit, few of these lawmen became household names, unless a dime novel got involved. Reeves, despite his astonishing record, was nearly forgotten for decades, perhaps because he didn't fit the mold the West was trying to sell. Still, the law moved, slow, relentless, and sometimes wearing a black coat. And when the courtroom caught up, it often belonged to one man. 38. Judge Isaac Parker of Fort Smith, Arkansas, the hanging judge, presided over Indian Territory felonies with federal juries. Judge Isaac Parker didn't set out to become a symbol, but when you earn a nickname like the hanging judge, symbolism tends to follow you. From his bench in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Parker oversaw one of the largest and most lawless regions in the country, Indian Territory, where crimes often outpaced lawmen and justice had to be imported by rail. Appointed in 1875, Parker's federal court had jurisdiction over 75,000 square miles, a space riddled with fugitives, feuds, and outlaws, banking on distance to protect them. The task? Try felonies committed in Indian Territory, murder, assault, robbery, and more, often brought in by deputies who had risked everything to make the arrest. Parker didn't wear a black robe. He wore a mustache like a cliff and a reputation like armor. He ran his court with military precision, holding court 6 days a week, often from sunrise to sundown. In 21 years, he tried more than 13,000 cases, a staggering number that reflects both the chaos of the region and his relentless pace. He sentenced 160 people to death, though only 79 were actually hanged, thanks to pardons or appeals. Still, the gallows at Fort Smith became infamous, looming large in Western imagination. But Parker wasn't a sadist. He was a complicated figure, supportive of native rights, a critic of the death penalty in principle, and a believer in swift justice. He often blamed Congress for refusing to give him alternatives. Parker's courtroom wasn't about moral clarity. It was about control, an attempt to impose structure on a region that hadn't asked for it. And when the law rode west, it needed someone to plant the gavel. That someone was Isaac Parker. But not every lawman waited for court. Some chased outlaws the old way, on horseback, across rivers, and deep into Texas badlands. 39. The Texas Rangers reorganized in 1874 into the Frontier Battalion, ranging from border work to tracking Comanche and outlaws. By 1874, the Texas Rangers had already been many things: vigilantes, scouts, Indian fighters, and glorified posies. But the post-Civil War West needed something a bit more official, or at least official-looking. That year, the Rangers reorganized into the Frontier Battalion, a semi-formal force tasked with restoring order along Texas's vast and often violent frontier. Led by Major John B. Jones, the Frontier Battalion wasn't a standing army. It was a mobile, lightly supplied riding force made up of men who could live off the land and shoot straight. Their job? To protect settlers from raids, pursue outlaws, and assert state control in regions where the line between criminal and folk hero was razor thin. The Rangers chased Comanche raiding parties, tracked down rustlers and horse thieves, and tangled with cross-border bandits who slipped in and out of Mexico like shadows. They operated with minimal oversight and maximum improvisation. Their methods were effective, but rarely subtle. Ambushes, forced confessions, and extra-legal executions were part of the reputation they earned, and the controversy they carried. Yet, for many Texans, the Rangers were more than enforcers. They were symbols, part myth, part muscle. They represented the idea that Texas didn't need Washington to solve its problems. Just a Winchester, a wide hat, and a little grit. The Frontier Battalion operated until the 1890s, when law enforcement became more bureaucratic and less frontier-based. But the Ranger legend only grew. In time, they'd become icons in song, film, and politics. Still, their early years were anything but polished. They rode through a land in flux, where treaties were tenuous, violence was common, and justice came at the end of a rifle barrel. And when they weren't guarding trains, some enterprising bandits figured out a new kind of business model, one that didn't need land, just leverage. 40. The Reno Gang pulled the first peacetime train robbery in 1866, kicking off a new outlaw business model. Before the Reno Gang, train robbery wasn't really a thing. Trains were new, efficient, and seen as symbols of progress. But in 1866, the Renos, four brothers from Indiana, decided progress was just another word for moving bank. They boarded an Ohio and Mississippi railway train, cracked open a safe, and made off with around $13,000. No shootout, no dramatic escape on horseback, just precision and timing. It was the first peacetime train robbery in U.S. history, setting the tone for a wave of similar crimes that would follow. The Renos quickly gained notoriety, robbing multiple trains and even attempting to torch a courthouse to destroy evidence. They weren't folk heroes. They were professionals, organized, ruthless, and without the usual outlaw charm. Law enforcement couldn't keep up. Railroads hired private detectives, Alan Pinkerton's agency chief among them. But the Renos had momentum. Towns were intimidated. Witnesses were scarce. And the gang kept moving, hitting banks and trains with unnerving efficiency. Eventually, their downfall came not from the law but from a vigilante mob. After several members were arrested and held in jail, the mob bypassed due process altogether. The Renos were taken from their cells and lynched, ending their spree but cementing their place in outlaw lore. Their impact lingered. The Reno Gang showed other criminals that the real money didn't sit behind saloon bars or in dusty stagecoaches. It rode the rails. Their heists inspired dozens of imitators, from Jesse James to Butch Cassidy. And unlike the quick grab of a wallet or horse, robbing a train felt industrial, scalable, modern. It was a new kind of Western crime for a new kind of Western frontier. And the next outlaw to follow in their footsteps? He brought poetry, a shotgun, and manners. 41st Stagecoach bandit Black Bart robbed with polite notes and a shotgun, twice leaving poems, once even complimenting a driver. Black Bart was not your average highwayman. He didn't drink, didn't swear, and wore a crisp white shirt under his duster. His stick-ups were quiet, efficient, and oddly polite. He robbed stagecoaches, mostly Wells Fargo ones, in Northern California during the 1870s and 1880s. And while most outlaws left chaos behind, Bart left poetry. Twice, after successful robberies, he left behind handwritten poems signed Black Bart the Poet, a tongue-in-cheek pseudonym for a man who clearly enjoyed theatrics. He'd greet stage drivers courteously, never harmed passengers, and often made jokes during the holdup. In one case, he even complimented a driver's calm under pressure. His weapon of choice? A shotgun, but he never fired it. In fact, it's likely that in several robberies, his weapon wasn't even loaded. What he relied on was timing, disguise, and a keen understanding of routine. He knew when the coaches would carry money, where they'd slow down, and how to vanish into the hills afterward. His real name was Charles Bowles, a former Union soldier with a fondness for literature and a grudge against Wells Fargo. He pulled off more than 25 robberies, evading capture for years. When he was finally caught in 1883, it wasn't a shootout that brought him down. It was a dropped handkerchief monogrammed with his laundry mark. After serving time, he vanished from public view, leaving behind a trail of mystery, folklore, and a reputation as the most gentlemanly bandit of the Wild West. He didn't steal to kill, and he didn't kill to steal. But others weren't so restrained. The next crew of outlaws that rose to fame had no poetry, only precision, and a strategy so effective it kept lawmen guessing for years. 42. Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch used fresh horses at hidden relay ranches to outrun posses after robberies. When Butch Cassidy and his crew, the Wild Bunch, went to work, they didn't improvise. They planned, rehearsed, and most crucially, they had fresh horses waiting at relay points miles apart. It was the 19th century version of a getaway car. These relay ranches were tucked away from prying eyes, remote, unassuming, often owned by sympathizers or gang members themselves. After pulling off a robbery, usually banks or trains, the gang would ride hard to the first ranch, swap horses, and keep moving. This allowed them to stay ahead of posses that followed with tired mounts and no knowledge of the route. It worked. Again and again. Cassidy, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker, wasn't your typical outlaw. He was charismatic, thoughtful, and oddly affable. His partner, Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, was the quieter but equally capable member of the duo. Together, and with a rotating cast of accomplices, they robbed their way across Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and into legend. The Wild Bunch's secret weapon was not just their relay system, it was their ability to blend charm with efficiency. They rarely resorted to violence, preferring speed and planning. Still, their crimes left railroads and banks furious. The Pinkertons were on their trail for years. Eventually, the pressure got too high. Cassidy and Sundance fled to South America, where they may or may not have met their end in a Bolivian shootout. No one knows for sure, but the legacy of their tactics lived on. They proved that with enough preparation and fresh horses, even the fastest justice couldn't catch you. And sometimes being a criminal wasn't about greed, it was about old grudges, old wars, and a country still learning how to heal. 43. Jesse and Frank James were ex-Confederate guerrillas, whose robberies blurred grudges from the Civil War with outlawry. The James brothers weren't just robbing banks, they were finishing a war. Jesse and Frank James, former Confederate guerrillas from Missouri, brought the rage of the Civil War's bleeding border states into the age of railroads and vaults. To them, outlawry wasn't just crime, it was continuation. The war had ended, but the resentment hadn't. During the war, the brothers rode with Quantrill's Raiders, a notorious Confederate bushwhacker unit responsible for guerrilla tactics and brutal raids. After 1865, rather than reintegrate, they turned to a new battlefield. Banks, trains, and institutions tied to Northern capital. Their robberies often targeted Unionist-affiliated banks and railroads, though not always. It wasn't political purity, it was deeply personal. Jesse, the showman, became the face of the gang, Frank, the thinker, stayed in the shadows. Their exploits, bold, theatrical, and violent, were quickly inflated into legend by sympathetic Southern newspapers, which painted them as folk heroes resisting Northern control. To some, they were Robin Hoods. To others, they were bitter ex-soldiers with guns and no peace. Their gang operated across Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, and beyond, often vanishing into rural communities that sympathized with their cause or feared them enough to stay quiet. Lawmen struggled to pin them down, and the press gave them mythic status. Eventually, Jesse's paranoia and infamy caught up with him. In 1882, he was shot in the back by Robert Ford. A gang member promised a pardon and reward. Frank later surrendered and, unlike Jesse, lived a quiet post-crime life. Their legacy? A case study in how unresolved national wounds can fester into personal vendettas. The James brothers robbed with revolvers, but they were also carrying history. And in the West, history didn't just repeat. It often turned into turf wars. Like the one in New Mexico, where one teenager rode into legend and never quite rode out. 44. The Lincoln County War, 1878 in New Mexico, pitted rival business factions. Billy the Kid was a deadly side character, not the script. The Lincoln County War wasn't about honor. It was about beef contracts, dry goods, and monopoly power. In 1870s New Mexico, Lincoln County was controlled by a tight-knit business clique, Murphy and Dolan, who ran the only store, held key government contracts, and kept law enforcement in their pocket. Then came the challengers. Tunstall and McSween, English and Scottish newcomers who opened a rival store and tried to break the monopoly. The result wasn't a courtroom battle, it was a shooting war, with hired guns on both sides and the county turning into an undeclared combat zone. Enter Billy the Kid, not as a legendary outlaw but as a hired ranch hand and later a loyal avenger after his employer, John Tunstall, was murdered. Billy, born Henry McCarty, or William Bonney, depending on the alias, became a guerrilla fighter for the Tunstall side, riding with a group called the Regulators. Over the course of the conflict, he participated in ambushes, gunfights, and revenge killings. But he wasn't leading the story. He was swept up in it. The Lincoln County War spiraled out of control. The U.S. Army eventually intervened to restore order, but not before Lincoln's Main Street became a battlefield. McSween's house was burned. Dozens died. And when the dust settled, Billy the Kid was the only name people remembered. Over the next few years, Billy would bounce between hideouts, jailbreaks, and shootouts, becoming, posthumously, one of the most romanticized figures in Western lore. But in 1878, he was just a teenager with a gun and a grudge, playing a minor role in a much larger economic war. And this kind of war wasn't unique. In fact, another state, Wyoming, would stage its own high-stakes showdown between ranchers and rustlers, with even more explosive consequences. 45. The Johnson County War, 1892 in Wyoming, was a range conflict. Big cattle outfits versus alleged rustlers and small ranchers. In Johnson County, Wyoming, the war wasn't about law and order. It was about control of land, livestock, and reputation. On one side stood the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, representing wealthy cattle barons who believed the open range belonged to them. On the other, small homesteaders, independent ranchers, and supposed rustlers, many of whom were simply trying to carve out a life on the frontier. The big outfits accused the smaller operators of stealing cattle. The small ranchers accused the cattle barons of fencing public land, hoarding water, and manipulating the law. Tensions simmered, then boiled. In 1892, the stock growers launched a full-blown private invasion. They hired about 50 gunmen, loaded them onto a train from Cheyenne, and headed north with a hit list of men to eliminate. Their first target was a rancher named Nate Champion, who held out in a cabin under siege for hours before being killed. His journal, found afterward, read like a last will. Word spread. Johnson County Sheriff raised a local posse, hundreds of armed men, who surrounded the invaders at the TA Ranch. A tense standoff followed until the U.S. cavalry arrived, not to arrest the invaders, but to escort them safely away, under orders from the governor, who was sympathetic to the stock growers. In the end, no one was convicted. The legal system, heavily influenced by powerful cattle interests, ensured the war's instigators walked free. But public opinion shifted. The Johnson County War exposed the fragility of Western justice when wealth and violence joined hands. It also marked the symbolic end of the era when cattle barons could act as warlords. And from then on, the battle over cows wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with brands. 46. Branding was legal ID for cattle. Counties recorded brands the way cities record deeds. In the open-range days of the West, cattle didn't graze in neat little pens. They roamed, miles at a time, over public and private land, often mixing with herds from a dozen different ranches. So how did you tell one cow from another? You didn't. You branded it. A branding iron, heated in a fire and pressed to the hide, left a permanent unique mark, a rancher's signature. These marks weren't casual doodles. They were legally recognized identifiers, recorded by county offices and registries as formal property claims. If your cow bore your brand, it was yours, full stop. Designing a brand was an art and a science. It had to be simple enough to identify at a glance, complex enough to deter forgery, and distinct within your region. Brands were read like a language, using symbols and abbreviations, a circle around a letter, a bar underneath, a running W. Ranchers would say things like bar T or circle H to refer to specific outfits. Unbranded calves were called mavericks, fair game under many local codes. Some claimed them as their own, others fought over them. Branding disputes led to lawsuits, gunfights, and in more than one case, full-on range wars. A stolen cow with a tampered brand was a risky bet. Skilled rustlers could try to blot or alter brands, but if caught, it meant jail, or worse. For this reason, branding became more than tradition. It became the backbone of Western property law. And just like people branded their herds, nature branded theirs back. Through an invisible mark that sparked chaos, panic, and lawsuits whenever it crossed state lines, something far more dangerous than a crooked cow thief. 47. Texas fever, a tick-borne disease, sparked quarantine lines and interstate cattle disputes during the trail drive years. It wasn't just barbed wire or bad winters that threatened the cattle industry. Sometimes it was something you couldn't even see. Texas fever, a tick-borne disease carried by southern longhorns, quietly devastated herds across the Midwest and plains, and nearly sparked a civil war within the cattle business. Longhorns had immunity. They carried the ticks without issue, but northern and Midwestern cattle didn't. When the fever spread through contact or shared water, it hit hard. High fevers, weakness, and sudden death. Ranchers quickly realized that herds coming up the Chisholm Trail from Texas were leaving a trail of corpses behind them, just not their own. The reaction was swift and angry. States like Kansas and Missouri began passing quarantine laws, restricting the movement of Texas cattle during warm months when ticks were most active. Inspectors were appointed. Armed guards were posted at state lines. In some places, trail herds were turned back at gunpoint. This was more than a veterinary problem. It was a legal and economic storm. Texas ranchers saw it as discrimination and a threat to their survival. Northern ranchers saw it as a matter of life and death for their own herds. Lawsuits followed. So did quiet midnight crossings, where trail drivers would sneak herds past quarantine lines under cover of darkness. Eventually, the science caught up. The role of ticks was confirmed. Precautions improved. But the episode revealed something deeper. Even in the land of the free range, disease could draw invisible fences that law, bullets, and brands couldn't prevent. It also proved how interconnected the cattle economy really was. One infected steer in Texas could wipe out a ranch in Nebraska. And when land was life, settlers had to get creative, especially in places where there were no trees and the wind never stopped. 48. Homesteaders built soddies, houses cut from prairie turf, where timber was scarce and wind an uninvited roommate. The prairie had plenty of grass but almost no trees. So when homesteaders arrived on the Great Plains, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862, they had to improvise. With wood in short supply and freight expensive, they turned to what they had in abundance: earth. Thus, the sod house, or soddy, was born. Built by stacking thick slabs of turf cut with special plows, sod houses were cheap, insulating, and surprisingly sturdy. They kept cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and stayed upright through punishing prairie winds. But they had downsides: insects, leaking roofs, and a constant dust problem that never quite went away. Rain could reduce the walls to mud. Snakes and rodents occasionally dropped in, literally from the ceiling. Still, for thousands of families, soddies were the first real shelter they'd ever owned. They were built by hand, often in a matter of days, using nothing but muscle and hope. Kitchens, beds, and stoves were tucked inside compact earthen walls. Windows were scarce. Light came through oiled cloth or improvised panes. Floors were sometimes dirt, sometimes packed clay. Inside, life was harsh but determined. Women cooked over open flames while children swatted flies with strips of rawhide. Every creak and howl of the wind reminded settlers that they weren't just building homes. They were trying to outlast the land itself. And yet, these humble dwellings offered something profound: a legal foothold, a claim to ownership, a start. They were symbols of survival, resourcefulness, and stubborn belief in a future. Of course, the promise of free land came with conditions and paperwork. The government didn't give away acres without strings, and one of those strings stretched 5 years long. 49. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to claimants who lived on and improved the land for 5 years. In 1862, the U.S. government made a sweeping offer: 160 acres of public land, free, well, mostly free, to anyone willing to live on it, build on it, and farm it for 5 consecutive years. It was called the Homestead Act, and it reshaped the map of the American West. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of concentrating land in the hands of the wealthy, the act opened it to ordinary citizens, immigrants, single women, and formerly enslaved people. The requirements weren't small. Claimants had to build a dwelling, cultivate crops, and stay put for half a decade. But if they succeeded, the land became theirs. Over the next several decades, millions took the offer. From the plains of Nebraska to the dusty corners of New Mexico, homesteaders staked claims, raised soddies, planted wheat, and weathered everything from locusts to loneliness. But not all succeeded. Many abandoned their claims before 5 years were up, defeated by drought, debt, or sheer isolation. The land wasn't always as generous as the promise. Still, the Homestead Act created over 1 million land titles, turning dreams into deeds. It also had unintended consequences, accelerating the displacement of native peoples and intensifying land conflicts. But for many, it was the first and only chance at real ownership. And despite the hardships, it wasn't just men who claimed land. The law, unusually for its time, didn't exclude women. 50. Single women, widows, and formerly enslaved people could and did claim homesteads, title in their own names. The Homestead Act didn't care about gender or background, at least not on paper. If you were 21 or older, or the head of a household, you could file a claim. That loophole opened the door for a surprising group of landowners in the West: single women, widows, and freedmen. They came with few resources but fierce intent. Widows whose husbands had died in war or illness filed solo. Single women, looking for independence, saw homesteading as a radical alternative to marriage. And formerly enslaved people, newly freed after the Civil War, used the law to stake literal ground for their future. These homesteaders faced extra hurdles: social, financial, and legal. They were often isolated, targeted by prejudice, or refused credit. But many succeeded. Women built cabins, plowed fields, and raised livestock. Formerly enslaved claimants established communities and carved towns out of prairie and pine. Their names don't always appear in textbooks, but their land titles do. Signed, sealed, and legally theirs. They were part of a quieter Western story, not the gunslingers, not the cattle barons, but the people who turned dust into permanence through sheer will. They also proved something profound, that ownership could be empowerment, even on the harshest frontier. And once that land was secured, it needed one thing above all else: water. 51. Windmills and later deep well pumps made water the real currency of the plains. Without water, a deed was just paper. The West wasn't conquered by grit alone. It was conquered by water, or rather, the desperate hunt for it. On the Great Plains, rainfall was unreliable, rivers were distant, and most surface water dried up by midsummer. That meant homesteaders faced an inconvenient truth. Owning land meant nothing without a way to hydrate it. Enter the windmill. These tall, skeletal towers became icons of the prairie, spinning quietly above fields, powering deep well pumps that pulled water from aquifers below. With windmill technology, settlers could finally access water that lay dozens or even hundreds of feet underground. Suddenly, crops survived, livestock thrived, and towns became possible. Before windmills, hauling water by hand was exhausting, and irrigation was a fantasy. After them, wells became lifelines. Farms that had barely clung on began to prosper, or at least survive. Later, mechanized deep well pumps pushed the limits even further, reaching deeper water tables and allowing larger-scale agriculture. But even with technology, water was never guaranteed. Droughts, broken machinery, and overuse could still bring a farm to its knees. In courtrooms and community meetings, water rights became fierce debates. Who could drill? How deep? Whose cattle got the first drink? Land ownership might be listed on a deed, but water ownership, that was the real power. And so, across the prairie, windmills turned like slow, stubborn flags, marking not just property, but survival itself. Because in the West, land was cheap, water wasn't. 52. Dry farming techniques, deep plowing and fallow rotation, helped settlers wrestle crops from low rainfall country. The plains weren't made for soft hands or shallow roots. With low rainfall, unpredictable seasons, and soil that was fertile but finicky, settlers had to adapt or leave. Many chose to adapt, giving rise to a set of strategies known collectively as dry farming. At its core, dry farming was about moisture management. Farmers used deep plowing to reach below the dry crust of the soil and access what little moisture remained. Fields were often left fallow, unused, for a season, allowing the ground to store rainwater and recover nutrients. Surface layers were occasionally dusted or stirred to reduce evaporation. It wasn't magic. It was marginal. Crops grew, but yields were small and risky. Timing became everything. A poorly placed seed or a missed rain could doom a harvest. But when it worked, it proved that even in a place where rain refused to fall, something could grow. Dry farming didn't just shape agriculture, it shaped towns, economies, and migration patterns. It allowed permanent settlements in areas previously written off as desert. It also forced farmers to rethink what crops to plant, favoring wheat, barley, and hardy grains over water-hungry staples. Still, the limits were clear. Dry farming was survival strategy, not a golden ticket. It bought time, but without long-term water solutions, it couldn't guarantee prosperity. That's where federal land policy stepped in, offering not just land, but incentives for changing it. The land was stubborn. The government, even more so. 53. The Timber Culture Act, 1873, and Desert Land Act, 1877, tried to green the plains and spur irrigation. Mixed results. If the land wouldn't cooperate, maybe legislation could fix it. That was the idea behind two federal experiments in climate optimism: the Timber Culture Act of 1873 and the Desert Land Act of 1877. Both aimed to encourage settlement and reshape the land in the process. The Timber Culture Act granted settlers an additional 160 acres if they agreed to plant and maintain trees on at least 40 of them. Lawmakers believed trees could help break wind, retain moisture, and eventually make the plains more hospitable. In theory, it was landscape engineering via sapling. In reality, it often led to dead groves and paperwork. The Desert Land Act, meanwhile, targeted the arid West. It offered up to 640 acres to individuals who promised to irrigate the land within 3 years. The idea was simple: water the desert, make it bloom. But enforcement was weak, and many claimants used the act to grab land cheaply, with little intention or ability to irrigate anything. Both acts had mixed results. Some settlers genuinely tried. Others gamed the system. Some trees survived. Many didn't. A few canals were dug, but large-scale irrigation remained costly and complex. Still, these policies signaled a federal push to reimagine the West. Not just as open space, but as transformable terrain. The laws were less about stewardship and more about speculation. And while trees struggled to take root, trails didn't. The West wasn't just built on homesteads. It was paved by the ruts of wagons, the routes of commerce, and the dreams of movement. 54. The Santa Fe Trail moved commerce between Missouri and New Mexico. The Oregon and California trails moved families and hopes. The West didn't begin with gunfights. It began with ruts in the earth, carved by wagon wheels and boot soles. Long before the railroads and long after Lewis and Clark, the Great Migration began across a network of trails that mapped ambition in real time. The Santa Fe Trail, active from the 1820s through the 1870s, linked Missouri to New Mexico. It was a trail of commerce, not colonization, used by traders, merchants, and military convoys, moving manufactured goods west and precious metals east. Towns along the way thrived on supply and demand, while the trail itself became a corridor of cultural exchange and conflict. Meanwhile, the Oregon Trail and the California Trail served a different purpose: settlement. These were the arteries through which thousands of families, farmers, and fortune seekers headed west in search of land, freedom, and a second chance. The journeys were long, often 6 months or more, and fraught with danger, disease, and disappointment. But for many, the risk was worth the dream. These trails weren't marked by signs but by graves, river crossings, and the skeletal remains of failed wagons. They wove through mountain passes, across deserts, and into legend. By the 1870s, the railroad would overtake them, but the memory of those wagon trains never faded. They symbolized movement, not just of people, but of culture, law, and identity. And not all movement was westward for gold. For some, the journey was religious, communal, and quietly radical, heading to a high desert to build Zion by hand. 55. The Mormon Trail carried a religious community west. Utah's settlements knitted irrigation, village grids, and communal labor. Driven by persecution, violence, and a relentless search for peace, the Mormon pioneers weren't just another wagon train. They were a full-blown exodus. After the murder of founder Joseph Smith in 1844 and repeated conflicts across Illinois and Missouri, Brigham Young led thousands of followers westward in 1847, along what became known as the Mormon Trail. Their destination? The remote Salt Lake Valley, then part of Mexico. It wasn't exactly the promised land, but it was isolated, and that was the point. Unlike many Western settlers, the Mormons arrived not as individuals, but as a collective. They came prepared to build not just homes, but entire communities, grounded in faith, labor, and mutual dependence. The resulting settlements were carefully planned: village grids, central meeting houses, and plots distributed by church leadership. Their real innovation? Irrigation. Using community labor, They built an intricate network of canals, ditches, and dams, turning desert into farmland. Every stream had a purpose. Water wasn't owned, it was assigned and scheduled. This system allowed crops to flourish where nature said they shouldn't. Mormon towns dotted the Utah Territory and beyond, each a blend of religious utopia and agricultural discipline. Labor was shared, resources were pooled, and the church guided nearly every aspect of life, from architecture to education to the law. This model created stability, but also tension. The federal government didn't know what to make of it, and wouldn't tolerate Mormon autonomy for long. Still, for a community used to being driven out, Utah was a hard-earned stronghold. But that didn't mean the land was peaceful. The road to Zion was marked by tragedy, and one such event remains a scar. 56. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, 1857, involved Utah militia and Paiute allies killing a passing emigrant party, an enduring scar. In 1857, a wagon train from Arkansas, known as the Baker-Fancher Party, was passing through southern Utah en route to California. What happened next remains one of the darkest and most controversial events in Western history. The Mountain Meadows Massacre. The emigrants, roughly 120 men, women, and children, were attacked by a group of Mormon militia from nearby settlements, aided by Paiute Native Americans. Over the course of 5 days, tensions escalated until the travelers were lured out under a flag of truce, disarmed, and then attacked. Nearly all were killed, except for a few children who were taken in by local families. Why it happened is still debated. Context matters. That year, the U.S. government had dispatched troops to Utah in what would become known as the Utah War, fearing a Mormon rebellion. The Mormon leadership, already suspicious of outsiders, was in a defensive posture. Rumors spread that the emigrants were hostile or spies. What followed was a catastrophic decision. The massacre shocked the nation. Though full details were slow to emerge, the LDS Church distanced itself from the incident and blame was deflected for years. Ultimately, only one man, John D. Lee, was executed for his role, decades later. To this day, the event remains painful and controversial. It disrupted Mormon relations with both the federal government and native tribes, cast a long shadow over Utah's settlement history, and challenged the myth of moral clarity often attached to westward expansion. Mountain Meadows wasn't just a tragedy. It was a rupture, a moment when fear, ideology, and misjudgment turned settlers into perpetrators. And they weren't the only ones who were forcibly moved through that territory. Another march would echo even more deeply across the desert. 57. The Navajo Long Walk, 1864, forced thousands to Bosque Redondo. Many died before the treaty allowed a return. In 1864, under the direction of Kit Carson and U.S. military orders, thousands of Navajo men, women, and children were forcibly removed from their homelands in what's now Arizona and New Mexico. The military called it resettlement. The Navajo remember it as the Long Walk. The march to Bosque Redondo, a remote reservation in eastern New Mexico, spanned over 300 miles. The journey was brutal, cold, undersupplied, and deadly. Roughly 8,000 Navajo were relocated. Many died from exposure, starvation, and illness along the way or after arrival. The destination was no sanctuary. Bosque Redondo was poorly planned, ill-suited for agriculture, and plagued by bad water and crop failures. Supplies were inconsistent. Tensions with neighboring tribes, including the Mescalero Apache, who had also been relocated there, further destabilized the settlement. Conditions were so dire that even government agents began reporting the site as uninhabitable. After 4 years of suffering, the U.S. government reversed course. In 1868, a treaty was signed allowing the surviving Navajo to return to a portion of their homeland, marking one of the few instances where a forcibly displaced tribe was permitted to return. The scars of the Long Walk remain embedded in Navajo history, oral, tradition, and identity. It was more than a forced march. It was an attempt to erase a people by removing them from the land that sustained them. But the return was not a restoration. It was a negotiation, and tensions between tribes, settlers, and the U.S. military would continue, especially as gold and railroads closed in on lands that had already been promised. 58. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty created a large Sioux reservation, including the Black Hills. Gold rushes soon strained it. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 was, on paper, a peace agreement, signed between the U.S. government and the Lakota Sioux, along with affiliated Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. It established a Great Sioux reservation west of the Missouri River, including the sacred Black Hills. In return, the U.S. pledged to stop encroachment and abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail. For a while, it seemed to hold. The Lakota moved into the designated area, and the U.S. Army withdrew. But peace has a short shelf life when gold enters the picture. By the mid-1870s, prospectors began slipping into the Black Hills, reporting rumors, and later proof, of rich gold deposits. Word spread fast. Soon, waves of miners flooded into the region, violating the treaty outright. The U.S. government, rather than enforce the terms, tried to renegotiate, offering to buy the land. The Sioux refused. It wasn't just about property, it was about sovereignty and spirituality. The Black Hills were sacred ground, not real estate, but the government's patience was thinner than its promises. What followed was a familiar pattern: failed diplomacy, rising tensions, and the slow march toward armed conflict. The Great Sioux War of 1876 was waiting just over the horizon. The Fort Laramie Treaty became a symbol, not just of broken promises, but of how treaties on the frontier were often written in sand, erased the moment something glittered beneath it, and the coming war wouldn't just be another skirmish. It would lead to one of the most iconic and misunderstood battles in American history. 59. The Great Sioux War, 1876-77, included the Little Bighorn, where Lakota and Cheyenne forces defeated Custer's 7th Cavalry. The Great Sioux War was triggered by greed, but fueled by something older: the refusal of a people to be cornered. In 1876, the U.S. military launched a campaign to force the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne back onto their reservations after they rejected new treaty terms, especially the sale of the Black Hills. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, already a celebrity from the Civil War and eager to expand his legend. His target, a large encampment of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families who had gathered under leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. Custer underestimated everything: numbers, strategy, terrain. On June 25, 1876, he divided his forces and led his men into what would become the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. The result was swift and stunning. The native coalition overwhelmed Custer's 7th Cavalry, killing Custer and over 200 of his men. It was the most decisive native victory in American history, and a short-lived one. The U.S. government, humiliated and furious, doubled down. Reinforcements were sent. Supply lines strengthened. Within a year, most of the native leaders had surrendered or been forced back onto reservations. The Black Hills were seized without consent and never legally returned. The victory at Little Bighorn became a symbol for native resistance, for military arrogance, and for a fading moment when indigenous strategy outmaneuvered federal might. But it wasn't the end. In the decades that followed, another movement would rise. Not one of war, but of spirit. One last dance against the dying light. 60. The Ghost Dance movement, 1889-90, promised renewal. Fear and tension culminated at Wounded Knee in 1890. By the late 1880s, the western frontier had closed, not just geographically, but spiritually. For many native communities confined to reservations, hope was fraying. Traditional ways were restricted. Buffalo were gone. Cultures were under siege. Into that desperation came a new prophecy: the Ghost Dance. It began with a Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka, who claimed to have had a vision during a solar eclipse. He said that if Native people performed the ghost dance ritual, a great transformation would follow: the return of ancestors, the disappearance of white settlers, and the restoration of the buffalo. But it wasn't a call to violence. It was a religious revival, centered on peace, renewal, and resistance through faith. The movement spread rapidly across tribal nations, particularly among the Lakota, who adopted it with powerful symbolism. The U.S. authorities, however, saw it as a threat. The dancing, the gatherings, the belief in spiritual invincibility, it all made the military nervous. By 1890, tensions were at a boiling point. The U.S. ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull, and during the chaotic attempt, he was killed. Fearing a wider uprising, the Army moved to disarm a group of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. What happened there would become one of the most infamous and sorrowful episodes in Western history. It wasn't a battle. It was a collapse of trust, restraint, and humanity. But the ghost dance itself wasn't about conquest. It was a final act of spiritual defiance, a prayer for renewal in a world being erased. And that quiet resistance wouldn't die. It would echo into the next century, through stories, songs, and soldiers, some wearing blue, some wearing buffalo nicknames. 61. At Wounded Knee, Hotchkiss guns cut down hundreds, men, women, and children, marking a tragic bookend to the Indian Wars. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry surrounded a camp of Lakota Sioux under Chief Bigfoot, who had been attempting to lead his people to safety. The soldiers, under orders to disarm the group, were tense. The Lakota were cold, tired, and fearful. Misunderstanding and anxiety hung thick in the frozen air. Then a single shot rang out. What followed wasn't a battle. It was chaos. The Hotchkiss guns, light artillery pieces positioned above the camp, opened fire. The soldiers fired into the confusion. When it was over, hundreds of Lakota lay dead, many of them women and children. Wounded Knee is often described as the end of the Indian Wars, not because it brought peace, but because it represented the final extinguishing of organized Native resistance in the continental U.S. After this moment, the fight for land, culture, and autonomy moved from battlefields to courts, classrooms, and memory. The event shocked some corners of the American public, but others called it a victory. Soldiers were awarded medals, survivors were scattered. The site became a graveyard, both literal and symbolic. Wounded Knee did not erase Native identity, but it did mark a turning point in how the U.S. approached indigenous policy, moving from conquest to assimilation. But not every Native person was disarmed. Some joined the very forces they once resisted. Wearing uniforms stitched by the same government that took their land, they carved out a new role in a deeply ironic chapter of Western history. 62. Buffalo Soldiers, black regiments raised in 1866, served as cavalry and infantry across the West for decades. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army created several black regiments, 2 of cavalry and 4 of infantry. Among the most famous were the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments. Native tribes began calling these men Buffalo Soldiers, a name possibly referencing their curly hair, their bravery, or both. These soldiers served across the western frontier, often tasked with some of the most grueling and dangerous assignments: escorting settlers, guarding stage routes, fighting in conflicts against native nations, and patrolling vast unsettled territories. Their service was consistent, disciplined, and often uncelebrated. In a tragic twist, many Buffalo soldiers found themselves participating in military campaigns against Native peoples, groups who, like them, had suffered under U.S. expansion. But the Army was one of the few institutions that offered black men steady employment, pay, and a form of limited respect during Reconstruction and after. They built forts, strung telegraph lines, and held the line on an ever-shifting frontier. Their units earned reputations for endurance, precision, and courage, qualities often left out of early Western mythology. Though often stationed in remote outposts and denied promotions or equal treatment, the Buffalo Soldiers left a deep imprint on the West. Statues and stories now honor their legacy, but for decades, their contributions were quietly overlooked. Their name remains iconic, a tribute not just to their battles, but to their perseverance. And just as they rode across the prairies, so did another American icon, albeit in vastly larger numbers, and on 4 legs. 63. Bison herds crashed from tens of millions to under 1,000 by the late 1880s. Market hunting and habitat loss did the work. Once numbering 30 to 60 million, the great bison herds of North America thundered across the plains in a nearly unbroken sea of hooves and horns. They were a keystone species for both ecosystems and native cultures, providing food, shelter, clothing, and spiritual significance. By the late 1880s, those millions had been reduced to fewer than 1,000. The causes were deliberate and devastating. Market hunters, driven by demand for hides and tongues, slaughtered bison at industrial scale. Railroads made it easier. Hunters could ride the rails, shoot from moving trains, and ship carcasses east by the ton. Habitat loss, disease, and overhunting sealed the deal. Some U.S. officials even encouraged the extermination of bison as a way to undermine native livelihoods, accelerating the push toward reservation dependence. It wasn't just environmental, it was political. The prairies fell silent. For many tribes, the loss of the bison wasn't just economic, it was existential. Centuries of knowledge, culture, and tradition revolved around the buffalo. Its disappearance marked the erasure of a way of life. By the turn of the century, a few conservation-minded individuals, including former hunters, began efforts to save the remaining herds. Small sanctuaries formed. Populations slowly rebounded, though never to their former numbers. Today, the bison is both a symbol of American resilience and a reminder of how quickly abundance can turn to scarcity when short-term gain tramples long-term balance. And where the buffalo once roamed, another economy took shape, built not on horns and hides, but on bones. 64. Hide hunters shipped mountains of robes and tongues by rail. Bones became fertilizer, an economy built on an erasure. When the bison fell, the scavengers arrived. With the big game herds vanishing across the plains, hide hunters stepped in to extract the last profitable pieces of a dying species. Buffalo robes, soft, thick, and warm, were in high demand for Eastern parlors and European winters. Tongues, considered a delicacy, fetched premium prices. The rest of the animal? Often left to rot at first. But even decay became economy. By the 1880s, the vast plains were littered with sun-bleached skeletons, stretching for miles. And so came the next industry, bone picking. Crews gathered tons of buffalo bones, which were then shipped east by rail and ground into fertilizer and bone china. In some towns, bones even became a form of currency, used to trade for goods or pay off debts. It was an industry born from annihilation. Every carload of bones was a monument to what had been lost. The hunters weren't necessarily cruel. They were opportunists, feeding a market that didn't ask questions. Towns that sprang up along these trade routes boomed and busted in rhythm with the bones. And when the last pile was gone, the economy moved on, leaving behind only stories and silence. But not all animals vanished. Some adapted, some escaped, and some, like the Mustangs, ran wild and free, until someone tried to saddle the wind. 65. Mustangs, feral descendants of Spanish horses, were captured by mestineros and cowboys for ranch and cavalry remounts. Long before cattle herds thundered across the plains, there were horses. And not just any horses. Mustangs, descendants of Spanish stock brought to the Americas centuries earlier. Freed, escaped, or abandoned, these horses bred in the wild, creating fast, durable, sure-footed animals built for survival. By the 1800s, Mustangs roamed the Southwest and Great Basin in large numbers, often in tight, skittish herds. They were seen both as nuisance and necessity. To ranchers and cavalry commanders, They were a valuable resource. To farmers, they competed with livestock for grass and water. Capturing them was a skill all its own. Mesteneros, professional horse catchers, many of them Mexican or native, used elaborate traps, patience, and deep knowledge of the animal's habits. Some employed trained Judas horses to lure herds into corrals. Others ran them down across dusty valleys with relentless endurance. Mustangs were often broken and sold as ranch horses or used by the U.S. cavalry. Their agility and toughness made them prized remounts in rough terrain, though they lacked the polish of blooded breeds. Despite their utility, Mustangs were frequently targeted for removal, especially in the 20th century, when federal grazing and land use policies clashed with wild herds. Yet their legend persisted in dime novels, in rodeos, and in the idea of freedom with a mane. They weren't just animals. They were symbols of the frontier, of resistance, and of a West that wouldn't be tamed without a chase. But while Mustangs ran wild, one experiment tried to go even wilder, swapping hooves for hooves from the other side of the world. 66. The U.S. Army's Camel Corps, 1850s, tested dromedaries in the deserts. They worked, but the Civil War ended the experiment. In the dry, sun-bleached deserts of the American Southwest, horses and mules struggled. So, in true frontier fashion, someone proposed a solution that sounded like a punchline. Camels. The idea wasn't entirely outlandish. Camels were proven desert animals, strong, adaptable, and nearly tireless. So in the 1850s, the U.S. Army imported dozens of dromedaries from the Middle East, launching the Camel Corps. They were stationed in Texas and California, where they carried supplies across harsh terrain and astounded anyone who saw them. By most accounts, the camels performed well, better than mules over long distances with heavy loads. They required less water, could eat, scrub vegetation, and shrugged off the heat. But their very strengths worked against them. Camels spooked horses, smelled terrible, reportedly, and were famously difficult to manage without skilled handlers, many of whom had been brought over from the Ottoman Empire. Despite those quirks, the project had promise. Expeditions through the desert were successful. Surveys were completed faster, logistics improved. Then came the Civil War. The Army's priorities changed, funding dried up, and the Camel Corps dissolved. Some camels were sold off. Others escaped into the wild and were spotted for years, ghosts of a failed idea, wandering the empty spaces between settlements. Today, the Camel Corps is a historical footnote, odd, ambitious, and entirely Western in its mixture of pragmatism and absurdity. And as the railroad and telegraph took over desert routes, even the most exotic solutions became obsolete. But the lines they laid, literal and invisible, would go on to shape everything. 67. Telegraph lines often ran along railbeds, making stations both message hubs and gossip mills. In the age before texts and tweets, the telegraph was a revolution. Lightning in a wire, reshaping the way people connected across vast distances. In the West, telegraph lines were often strung alongside railroads, transforming dusty depots into nerve centers of communication. Train stations weren't just places to buy tickets or unload cattle. They became the Wi-Fi hotspots of the 19th century, nodes where news, orders, love letters, and lies zipped in and out in dots and dashes. The click-clack of a Morse key was the sound of connection, and sometimes the sound of war or wealth arriving just ahead of the train. Telegraph operators were a breed apart, part technician, part translator, and part town gossip. They could read a message before writing it down, and in many small towns, they knew things before the mayor did. From presidential election results to cattle prices, the operator's ear was always pressed to the wire. During lawless times, telegraph messages were how posses were summoned, warrants issued, or warnings sent. Outlaws learned to fear those lines, and some even tried cutting them, though usually too late. The telegraph shrunk the continent. What once took weeks by letter now arrived in minutes. And like all great inventions, it changed not just how people lived, but how fast they could react to the unexpected. Speaking of reacting quickly, when the terrain got too rough for rails and wires, settlers had to rely on a different kind of horsepower entirely, the kind that rolled heavy and creaked loud. 68. Freight wagons, Concords and Murphy wagons, were the big rigs of the trail long after locomotives arrived. Long before diesel engines and double trailers, the freight kings of the West came with canvas tops and wooden wheels. Concord wagons, known for their high suspension and durability, and Murphy wagons, famous for their size and strength, were the 18-wheelers of the 1800s. They hauled everything: mining gear, flour sacks, whiskey barrels, pianos, tombstones, you name it. Some were so heavily loaded they required 10 to 20 oxen or mules to pull them, creating massive caravans that crawled over mountains and deserts at a blistering pace of 2 miles an hour. Even after railroads carved steel veins through the West, many places remained off the grid. That's where freight wagons still ruled. They were lifelines for remote outposts and mining towns, keeping them supplied with everything from pickaxes to patent medicine. Driving one of these behemoths took skill and nerve. Teamsters had to navigate steep switchbacks, sudden rivers, and the ever-present risk of wheel collapse or axle failure. A blown tire today is an inconvenience. A shattered wagon wheel in the middle of nowhere? That was a crisis. Freight wagons left deep, literal ruts in the land, many of which still exist. They shaped trade routes, supply chains, and settlement patterns. And when you saw a string of them coming over the horizon, you knew two things: a town was about to liven up, and a bar tab was about to triple. Naturally, where there's money on the move, there's risk. And to guard the goods, a certain stagecoach company developed a reputation for serious security, often enforced at shotgun range. 69. Wells Fargo started as an express and banking firm. Armored coaches, shotgun messengers, and safes were its moving branches. Long before it became a modern bank with glass buildings and jingles, Wells Fargo was the Amazon Prime of the Wild West, only with more horses and significantly more revolvers. Founded in 1852, the company combined express delivery, banking, and stagecoach service into a single, fast-moving financial organism. Their bright red coaches became iconic across the frontier. They didn't just carry passengers. They hauled cash, gold, payrolls, and vital correspondence. And because the goods were valuable and the roads dangerous, Wells Fargo coaches often featured built-in safes and a very particular kind of employee riding shotgun, literally. The shotgun messenger wasn't just for show. Armed with a short-barreled, double-barreled shotgun, they were trained to defend the coach from bandits, road agents, and the occasional outlaw gang hoping for an early retirement plan. The term riding shotgun comes from this role, though today's version usually involves arguing over music playlists. Wells Fargo coaches became a symbol of reliability in an age when reliability was rare. They were meticulously maintained, operated on tight schedules, and backed by the company's growing financial power. The green and gold logo became a promise. Your valuables would arrive, or someone would pay dearly. Their presence expanded the reach of the economy, connecting mining camps, cattle towns, and boom towns to national markets. Money moved faster. So did risk. And while Wells Fargo ran the road, local law enforcement had to handle the towns themselves, each with its own jurisdictional mess and its own idea of justice. 70. Town marshals enforced local ordinances. County sheriffs handled warrants and jails. US Marshals chased federal crimes. Jurisdictions overlapped. In the Wild West, law enforcement wasn't so much a hierarchy as it was a layer cake of overlapping authority, where everyone had a badge, a gun, and a slightly different job description. From bustling cattle towns to backwater mining camps, keeping the peace required more than just firepower. It required knowing who answered to whom. Town marshals were local hires, often elected, sometimes reluctantly accepted, tasked with enforcing municipal ordinances. Their jobs ranged from breaking up bar fights to collecting stray pigs off Main Street. Their authority, however, typically ended at the edge of town. Just beyond that boundary, county sheriffs took over. They dealt with county-level crimes, served warrants, managed jails, and collected taxes. In sparsely populated regions, the sheriff was often the only law within hundreds of miles, which made the job as political as it was dangerous. And then there were the US Marshals, who didn't care about your cattle tax. They enforced federal law across massive territories, pursuing everything from stagecoach robbers to fugitives crossing state lines. Their deputies, like the legendary Bass Reeves, became frontier legends in their own right, roaming for months to bring in a single outlaw. The problem? These roles weren't always clear-cut. Jurisdictions overlapped, egos clashed, and sometimes multiple badges showed up at the same saloon with different ideas of who was in charge. It made for some interesting standoffs, not all of them violent, but many bureaucratic. And in a place where laws changed county by county, justice was often improvised. Still, some things weren't left to interpretation. In the scorching heat of the Southwest, one form of architecture stood the test of time and temperature. 71. Adobe architecture, Pueblo and Spanish in origin, kept interiors cool, a practical fit for New Mexico and Arizona heat. Before clapboard towns and brick saloons, the Southwest had its own architectural language, adobe. Made from sun-dried mud bricks, adobe structures were a legacy of Pueblo and Spanish colonial building traditions, long predating American statehood. And in the punishing heat of New Mexico and Arizona, these earthen walls weren't just beautiful. They were brilliantly functional. Adobe was cheap, local, and naturally insulating. The thick walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, keeping interiors surprisingly cool in summer and warm during chilly desert winters. Flat roofs, wooden beams, and small high-set windows added to the efficiency and character. You wouldn't see a frontier sheriff's office built this way in Kansas, but in Santa Fe, Tucson, or Las Cruces, adobe was everywhere. Homes, churches, trading posts, even forts. And it wasn't just practical. It had style. The rounded corners, earthy tones, and handcrafted textures gave adobe towns a unique, almost timeless aesthetic. As Anglo settlers moved in, many adopted the style, blending it with their own. The result? A fusion of cultures, visible not just in food or language, but in walls and rooftops. Adobe construction wasn't flashy. It didn't have stained glass or gilded spires, but it was adapted to the land, and it worked, century after century. But even peaceful pueblos weren't immune to conflict. Out in the open range, tensions were rising, not over land, but over what walked on it, or rather, what grazed it too low. 72. Sheep and cattle wars raged because wool growers grazed differently. Sheep were accused of ruining range grass. In the wide, windswept open range of the American West, the grass may have seemed endless, but it wasn't. And when cattlemen and sheep herders set their herds loose across the same fragile terrain, the result was inevitable. Range wars. Cattle grazed and moved, sheep grazed, and kept grazing. Unlike cattle, sheep chewed grass closer to the root, often leaving pastures barren. To ranchers who saw the land as their livelihood, this wasn't just annoying, it was seen as destructive. Tempers flared, fences were cut, herds were scattered, and in some cases, sheep drives were blocked or turned violent. Ranchers accused sheep herders, many of them Basque, Mexican, or native, of destroying the delicate balance of the plains. The reality was more complex. Overgrazing happened on all sides, especially during drought years. But in a place where water and grass meant survival, perception shaped policy, and policy shaped conflict. Territories like Wyoming, Arizona, and Colorado saw especially bitter disputes. Newspapers took sides. Politicians tried to calm things down, or depending on who backed their campaign, fan the flames. Despite all this, sheep herding thrived. Wool was a booming business, and many herders carved out long-lasting operations. Still, the stigma lingered. Even today, the phrase sheep man in old westerns carries a sneer. And while animals grazed outside, culture grew inside. Because even in the roughest frontier towns, civilization wasn't just a dream. It had its own stage. 73. Many frontier towns had opera houses and literary societies. Civilization and saloons grew side by side. We often picture the Old West as a symphony of gunshots and whiskey, but in many towns you could hear Mozart between bar fights. It turns out that while the saloons were busy serving rotgut, plenty of Western settlers were trying to build a little culture out of dust and dynamite. Opera houses, yes, actual opera houses, sprang up in mining camps and cattle towns across the frontier. They weren't just for arias and velvet curtains. These venues hosted lectures, political debates, vaudeville acts, church meetings, and the occasional traveling Shakespeare troupe. Some towns had fewer than 1,000 people and still found the resources to erect a theater with chandeliers and a balcony. Why? Because for all the rough edges, settlers weren't just carving out a living. They were trying to build community. And part of that meant proving they were more than their stereotypes. A town with an opera house wasn't just a cluster of tents. It was aspiring to permanence. At the same time, literary societies formed in back rooms and schoolhouses. These groups debated philosophy, read novels aloud, and discussed current events. Even in places where gunplay made headlines, reading circles quietly shaped local life. Newspapers covered these events with the same enthusiasm as local rodeos. It's easy to forget, but civilization didn't arrive after the West was tamed. It grew in tandem with the chaos. The saloon and the stage shared the same main street, and speaking of newspapers, every town had one, or three. And if you think modern comment sections are brutal, wait until you read the editorials from 1875. 74. Newspapers were everywhere. Editors feuded in print, and libel suits were a Western pastime. If a Western town had 2 buildings and a telegraph wire, odds are one of them had a printing press. Newspapers were as common as general stores, often more so, and just as important to how the West told its stories, to itself and the world. But this wasn't journalism as we know it. Editors weren't always impartial truth seekers. They were more like political brawlers with ink-stained fists. Newspapers took sides in elections, court cases, mining disputes, even personal feuds. If a rival editor crossed a line, the response might be a column titled something like, "A Drunk, a Coward, and a Liar, a Brief Biography of Mr. Jenkins." And yes, libel suits were common. So were duels, fistfights, and mysterious printing press accidents. But despite the drama, these papers were vital infrastructure. They published town ordinances, business ads, arrival and departure schedules, and marriage notices, sometimes right next to reports of shootouts. Newspapers also offered connection. Isolated ranchers and homesteaders read them to feel less alone. Letters to the editor ranged from poetry submissions to complaints about stray hogs. It was the social media of its day, complete with wild speculation, conspiracy theories, and gossip, thinly disguised as journalism. Some editors became folk heroes. Others fled town under cover of darkness. But all of them helped stitch the frontier into something more than just a wild blur. They gave it a voice. And in that voice, something remarkable emerged. Women demanding rights, not just roles. In one frontier territory, they got the vote before most eastern cities even considered the question. 75 women in Wyoming Territory gained the vote in 1869, followed by Utah, 1870, Colorado, 1893, and Idaho, 1896. In the dusty frontier of Wyoming Territory, something revolutionary happened. In 1869, women gained the right to vote, decades before the 19th Amendment, and decades before most of the so-called civilized East even entertained the idea. Why? The reasons weren't always noble. Wyoming needed settlers. It wanted to impress Congress. Some politicians thought it was a joke or a stunt. But once the law passed, it stuck, and something unexpected happened. Women showed up at the polls, ran for office, and got elected. The frontier, it turned out, was a space where roles were still being written. Following Wyoming's lead, Utah Territory granted women the vote in 1870. Though that right would be revoked and later restored due to political conflict with the federal government. Colorado followed in 1893 through popular referendum, a major milestone. And in 1896, Idaho joined the movement. These victories weren't just symbolic. Women used their votes to shape local policies, particularly in education, temperance, and public health. In some towns, women served as school superintendents, clerks, and even judges. The frontier wasn't always progressive, but it was fluid, and in that fluidity, space opened for women to claim a voice. Life on the range required partnership, resilience, and resourcefulness. And the ballot was one more tool to survive and shape the world around them. These early wins weren't without backlash, but they laid groundwork for national suffrage movements and proved that even in the wildest corners of the West, change was possible. And if you think voting was radical, wait until the federal government decided that entire landscapes were worth preserving. Not for profit, but for posterity. 76. Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872. The U.S. Army administered it before there was a park service. Long before it was dotted with tour buses and selfie sticks, Yellowstone was something radical, a chunk of land too beautiful, too strange, and too sacred to be sold. In 1872, Congress established it as the first national park, not just in the U.S. but in the world. The idea was bold for its time. America, after all, was still slicing up territory, selling plots, and laying track. But Yellowstone wasn't tamed farmland or a mining site. It was geysers, canyons, bubbling mud, and wildlife. The park's formation signaled a turning point, that maybe some parts of the West were worth preserving, not plundering. There was just one problem. No one knew how to protect it. With no park rangers or management infrastructure, Yellowstone was left vulnerable to poachers, vandals, and opportunists. So in 1886, the U.S. Army stepped in, stationing troops at Fort Yellowstone to guard the land. They built roads, enforced rules, and served as the de facto stewards of America's natural wonder for over 30 years. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The Army's presence set a precedent for federal land protection, laying the groundwork for the eventual creation of the National Park Service in 1916. Yellowstone became more than a destination. It was an experiment in coexistence between nature and government, and a quiet reminder that not all progress meant pavement. But not all stops on the western journey were scenic. Some were dusty, cramped, and full of overheard rumors. They were the connective tissue between far-flung settlements, and they ran on coffee, cursing, and sourdough. 77. Stage stations doubled as tiny hotels, blacksmith shops, corrals, and rumor exchanges, half infrastructure, half living room. The West didn't run on smooth logistics. It lurched forward in fits of horse-drawn chaos. And at the center of it all were the stage stations. Dusty, noisy, indispensable outposts spaced like clockwork along the travel routes. To the weary traveler, they were a beacon. To the horses, a necessity. These stations weren't glamorous, but they were lifelines. Every 10 to 20 miles, a stagecoach would stop to change teams, refuel, and briefly exhale. The facilities were usually a hodgepodge, a stable, a blacksmith, maybe a cookhouse, and if you were lucky, a cot or a corner to sleep in. But beyond horses and hardware, stage stations thrived as social hubs. They were where the news came first, before it hit newspapers or town criers. Travelers swapped gossip, drivers shared local updates, and innkeepers acted as informal news editors, sifting fact from frontier fiction. They were also places where conflicts boiled over or cooled down. Deals were made. Fights broke out. Marriages sometimes began or ended between stops. Stage station workers were often more important than they got credit for. Cooks, in particular, were revered or feared for their sourdough skills, their coffee, and their ability to serve a hot meal with exactly zero patience. And at the heart of every station was the trail cook, a figure with more power than you'd think. Because in the West, food wasn't just sustenance, it was authority with a ladle. 78. Trail cook was a high-status job. You guarded sourdough starter like a family heirloom and settled arguments with a ladle. In the democratic chaos of a cattle drive, trail cooks held a weird kind of absolute power. They didn't carry guns, usually, but they controlled something more potent. Hot meals, hot coffee, and the only edible thing for 100 miles in any direction. The trail cook's job started long before sunup. Coffee had to be ready, bacon sizzling, beans boiling. They drove the chuck wagon, kept the sourdough starter alive, and made sure there was always something on the fire, even if it was just boiling water and a prayer. And don't let the title fool you. Trail cooks weren't just flipping flapjacks. They were part medic, part mediator, and part unofficial judge. Arguments at camp were often settled by whatever the cook said had in hand, which was usually a ladle, skillet, or sharp tongue. You didn't mouth off to the cook unless you liked your beans salty with spite. Cooks also kept sourdough starter, sometimes passed down through generations, in a carefully wrapped pot or jar. Killing the starter by mistake? That was a punishable offense in some outfits, not legally but spiritually. The cook's wagon, or chuck wagon, became the camp's center of gravity. When it rolled into place, the day's rhythm followed. When it didn't show up, everyone got nervous. Trail cooks were often the least replaceable member of the crew because you can work without a wrangler, but without breakfast, that's mutiny. And yet, despite their role, even they couldn't escape the weird etiquette of cowboy culture, especially the bizarre pecking order of what you were called and what it meant. 79. Cowboy was once a mildly pejorative term. Cowpuncher or cowhand could imply more professional pride. Today, cowboy conjures up images of rugged individualism, wide-brimmed hats, and cinematic swagger. But in the 19th century West, calling someone a cowboy wasn't always a compliment. In some areas, it was more likely to get you a dirty look, or even a fist to the jaw, than a tip of the hat. The term cowboy originally carried a slightly disreputable edge, especially in regions like Arizona or New Mexico. It was sometimes used to describe young, reckless cattle thieves or general ne'er-do-wells who didn't quite measure up to the standards of the more seasoned cattlemen. Those who worked the trail professionally preferred terms like cowpuncher, cowhand, drover, or even just rider. These titles implied skill, endurance, and long days in the saddle, not just a hat and a revolver. Being called a cowpuncher meant you knew how to rope, ride, brand, and wrangle without losing your cool, or your cattle. Of course, language evolves. By the late 1800s, as dime novels and Wild West shows glamorized frontier life, cowboy gained traction as a heroic label, especially in the East. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be a cowboy, even if they had never been near a steer. But among actual trail crews, the name retained its nuances. In the bunkhouse or on the range, it still mattered what you were called, and whether you'd earned it. The same went for your gear. Not just what you wore, but how you wore it. Because for all the myths, cowboy fashion wasn't about looking cool. It was about staying alive in dust, heat, and unpredictable hooves. 80. Spurs, wide-brim hats, and bandanas were tools first. Fashion later. Shade, dust filter, horse cues. Before they became fashion statements in country music videos or high-end Western boutiques, the tools of the cowboy trade were exactly that. Tools. Each piece of gear had a purpose, often born of necessity and honed by experience on the open range. Spurs, for instance, weren't just for show. They were designed to cue horses with subtle signals. Turn here, speed up, slow down. Not to jab or punish. Good cowboys knew how to use spurs gently, communicating through metal and movement, not brute force. The wide-brim hat, typically a Stetson, was portable architecture. It offered shade in the sun, cover in the rain, and even served as a bucket when water was scarce. It was the Swiss Army knife of headwear, capable of fanning fires, swatting flies, or being tipped gallantly during introductions or apologies. And the bandana? It wasn't just a style flourish. It filtered out dust during drives, soaked up sweat, protected necks from sunburn, and occasionally doubled as a sling, mask, or emergency bandage. Cowboys didn't accessorize. They adapted. Even boots, with their angled heels and high shafts, were built for function. Easy stirrup access, snakebite protection, and minimal mud clog. Over time, these utilitarian items gained iconic status, but their roots were always in practicality. It's easy to romanticize the gear, but out on the plains, everything had to earn its place, because when you spent days in the saddle, the last thing you wanted was dead weight. And speaking of icons that earned their reputation, few tools in the West were more practical or more mythologized than the revolver and repeating rifle. 81. The Colt Single Action Army Revolver, 1873, and Winchester Model 1873 became icons because they were reliable, not because of nicknames. Forget what the movies told you. Nobody called it a peacemaker on the trail. The Colt Single Action Army Revolver, introduced in 1873, and the Winchester Model 1873 repeating rifle weren't admired for their poetry. They were respected because they worked, day after day, shot after shot. The Colt was a 6-shot revolver, rugged, simple, and designed for quick use. It became a military sidearm and a civilian favorite alike. You could load it while on horseback, fix it in the field, and trust it not to jam in a dust storm. Cowboys, lawmen, outlaws, and soldiers all used it, not because it made them legends, but because it got the job done. The Winchester 1873, meanwhile, earned the title "the gun that won the West" in later advertising campaigns. But out on the range, it was just known for its reliability and rapid fire. Its lever action mechanism allowed for fast shooting, and it shared ammunition with Colt revolvers, a feature that simplified logistics in a world where resupply might be 100 miles away. These guns weren't toys or trophies. They were tools of survival, used for hunting, defense, and work. If you had one, it meant you'd invested in practicality over bravado. And if you lived long enough to tell the tale, chances are your weapon never left your side. It wasn't about drama, it was about design. And while rifles got the glory, one type of firearm was often more trusted when the threat was close and the aim had to be sure. 82. Shotguns, coach guns, were common in towns and stage boxes. Close-range defense mattered more than long-range heroics. If the revolver was the sidekick and the rifle was the star, then the shotgun was the bruiser behind the bar. Short, loud, and unmistakably final. Often called coach guns, these double-barreled shotguns were the go-to weapon for stagecoach guards, saloon owners, and anyone who wanted to end an argument quickly and without discussion. They weren't elegant. They didn't have flashy names, but they were brutally effective where it mattered most. Close range. In tight quarters, say inside a swaying stagecoach or across a saloon doorway, a shotgun didn't have to be accurate. It just had to be pointed in the right direction. Stagecoach companies like Wells Fargo armed their shotgun messengers with these compact weapons. They sat next to the driver, ready to fire if road agents made their move. Their presence alone often deterred would-be robbers, because everyone knew that getting hit by a shotgun blast wasn't something you walked away from. In town, business owners also kept them under counters or behind doors. In an era before reliable police presence, it was up to shopkeepers to protect their cash box, and the coach gun was the insurance policy no one wanted to test. Even on the trail, cowboys preferred a shotgun for certain tasks, like dealing with snakes, predators, or that one belligerent drunk who wouldn't take no for an answer. You didn't duel with a shotgun, you defended your life with one. But despite all the hardware, the frontier wasn't the free fire zone Hollywood often sells. In fact, most killings didn't involve heroic standoffs. They involved bad timing, alcohol, and very little aim. 83. Many frontier killings involved alcohol and arguments, not high-noon duels. Homicide rates varied widely by community. The myth of the quick-draw duel, two men squaring off in a dusty street, watched by a hushed crowd, is cinematic gold. But it's mostly fiction. In reality, most frontier killings were messy, unplanned, and depressingly mundane. They happened in saloons after too many drinks, in gambling halls when someone accused someone else of cheating, in mining camps over unpaid debts or disputed claims. There were very few clean scripted standoffs at high noon. There were, however, plenty of shouted insults, clumsy grabs for pistols, and blind shots fired in panic. And the rate of violence? It varied wildly. Some towns were genuinely dangerous. Dodge City, Tombstone, or parts of Deadwood earned their reputations. But many frontier towns were remarkably peaceful, especially those with strong local governance, religious communities, or tightly knit settlers with more to lose than to prove. Historians digging into coroner records and newspaper archives have found that while the West was far from safe, it wasn't the constant bloodbath pop culture suggests. Some counties went months, sometimes years, without a single homicide. Others, not so much. In many cases, killers weren't hardened outlaws. They were neighbors, friends, even relatives, who made terrible decisions in hot moments. And the justice system? It could be lenient, erratic, or non-existent, depending on who you were and who you knew. The truth is, real frontier violence lacked the drama of legend. It was more chaotic, more tragic, and almost always less heroic. And where formal justice failed or simply didn't exist, people found other ways to impose order, ways that weren't always legal or fair. 84. Vigilance committees formed where formal courts lagged, sometimes stopping crime, sometimes becoming it. When justice took too long, or never showed up, vigilance committees stepped in. These were self-appointed groups of citizens who claimed to uphold law and order where courts, sheriffs, and marshals couldn't or wouldn't. Sometimes they were a last resort. Other times they were the real threat. In theory, vigilantes were a temporary fix. They chased down thieves, broke up criminal gangs, and enforced community standards in towns too new or too remote to have functioning legal systems. They held mock trials, posted notices, and in many cases, their actions were supported by the local population. But in practice, the line between justice and mob rule blurred fast. Once the precedent was set that a group of citizens could bypass the courts, it became a tool not just against outlaws but against rivals, immigrants, minorities, or anyone who challenged the status quo. What began as community defense could morph into intimidation or outright suppression. The most infamous of these groups, like San Francisco's 1851 and 1856 committees of vigilance, operated with alarming efficiency. They built their own jails, conducted investigations, and hanged people without formal verdicts. In some cases, their actions cleaned up corruption. In others, they simply replaced it with a different kind. The rise of vigilance committees reflects a deeper tension in the West, between order and autonomy, between justice and vengeance. And it's a reminder that when formal institutions are absent, people don't always default to fairness. They default to who's holding the rope. But even in towns ruled by gun or gavel, one profession paid the bills, funded the sidewalks, and kept the lights on, whether people liked it or not. 85. San Francisco's 1851 and 1856 vigilance committees were urban, not frontier. Proof the West included big city turmoil. When you think of vigilantes in the Wild West, your mind probably jumps to remote cattle towns or dusty mining camps. But one of the most organized and influential vigilante movements didn't happen in some windswept frontier. It happened in San Francisco, in the heart of a booming city already tangled in crime, politics, and gold-fueled ambition. The 1851 Vigilance Committee was formed in response to rampant crime and what many citizens viewed as a hopelessly corrupt justice system. After a few high-profile murders and botched court decisions, locals banded together and decided to take matters into their own hands. They hanged suspects, deported criminals, and effectively acted as judge, jury, and executioner. 5 years later, the 1856 Committee of Vigilance was even bigger and bolder. This time, it wasn't just about crime, it was about political corruption. The group boasted thousands of members, a central command structure, and even a makeshift fortress headquarters. They arrested city officials, executed suspects, and bypassed nearly every legal check in the book. And they were popular. For many San Franciscans, the committees were the only force capable of breaking the stranglehold of political machines and underworld alliances. But it came at a cost. These weren't just acts of frontier justice. They were exercises in raw civic power, outside the law. And once citizens get used to that idea, the definition of justice becomes dangerously flexible. It's a reminder that the Wild West wasn't just wilderness. Sometimes it looked like a thriving metropolis eating itself from the inside out. Out on the prairie, though, law and order had another unexpected enforcer, one often overlooked, but absolutely essential to any town's budget. 86. Prostitutes. Soiled doves, madams, and crib workers paid licensing fees and fines that often funded municipal budgets. Beneath the Sunday sermons and town hall meetings, the American West had an economy of vice. And it wasn't just tolerated. It was licensed, taxed, and quietly built into the civic budget. In many towns, prostitution wasn't an underground operation. It was a visible, regulated part of life. The euphemisms were many: soiled doves, ladies of the line, crib workers. But whatever the name, the role they played in frontier society was unmistakable. These women, often operating out of small rooms called cribs or under the management of more powerful madams, paid regular fees and fines that supported basic services like street maintenance, fire protection, and sometimes even schools. City councils, especially in boom towns, found it far more profitable to regulate than to abolish. Red light districts were officially designated. Licenses were issued. Fines were recorded in public ledgers right next to saloon fees and cattle taxes. And these weren't small sums. In towns with few revenue sources, the money brought in by regulated prostitution could make or break the budget. Still, the women who did this work occupied a precarious space. Respected, feared, pitied, and exploited, they lived with constant social contradiction. Some madams became wealthy and powerful. Others struggled in poverty and obscurity. Some found protection. Others found only vulnerability. But their contribution to the local economy? Undeniable. And when the dance halls opened and the music played, the West's contradictions played right along, especially when the sound came not from hurdy-gurdies, but from fiddles and pianos, echoing through smoky rooms and sawdust floors. 87. Hurdy-gurdy dance halls imported performers from Europe. The music was usually fiddle and piano, not street organs. Despite the name, hurdy-gurdy dance halls didn't actually feature hurdy-gurdies, the crank-operated street instruments you'd find in European cities. Instead, these frontier venues were filled with lively fiddle tunes, upright pianos, and the sound of boots on wood, thumping in uneven rhythm with whiskey-fueled laughter. The term hurdy-gurdy house became slang for a particular kind of dance hall, often associated with cheap thrills and paid companionship, but not necessarily full-blown brothels. These halls imported young women from Europe, especially Germany and Eastern Europe, to work as dance partners. They weren't necessarily sex workers, but they were expected to dance with male patrons, flirt, and encourage drink sales, earning a cut of each round. For many women, it was a job with independence, albeit one surrounded by scrutiny. In mining towns and lonely settlements, the hurdy-gurdy girl was often the only feminine presence in a sea of sweaty miners and roughneck cowhands. The music was simple but infectious. A fiddler could get a room moving with a reel, while a pianist hammered out waltzes or jigs. The beat was less important than the escape it offered, a few hours of noise, motion, and maybe a little hope. To outsiders, these halls were morally dubious. To locals, they were entertainment, social glue, and economic drivers. They also reflected the West's core contradiction, a world chasing virtue while cashing in on vice, sometimes all in the same building, just separated by a swinging saloon door. 88, Montgomery Ward, 1872, and later, Sears catalogs brought stoves, suits, and seeds to homesteads hundreds of miles from a store. Before strip malls and online carts, frontier families had their own version of Amazon Prime, and it came in the form of a paper brick dropped at the doorstep once a year, the mail-order catalog. When Montgomery Ward launched its first catalog in 1872, it was a single sheet of paper. But soon, it evolved into a full-blown guide to everything a homesteader could possibly want, from stoves and shovels to wedding rings and whiskey decanters. Later, Sears, Roebuck and Company joined the fray and turned the mail-order catalog into a cultural institution. The catalogs were more than just shopping tools. They were windows into modernity, offering a taste of urban convenience to families living hundreds of miles from the nearest general store. You could order a suit, a sewing machine, or even a prefab house, and it would arrive via rail and wagon, ready to assemble. The impact was enormous. These catalogs democratized access to goods that would otherwise have been limited to big city stores. Rural customers, many of them women, could now make decisions about household purchases without relying on local storekeepers or middlemen. The result was a subtle but powerful shift in autonomy. For children, the catalog was practically a toy. It was often the only printed material in the house besides the Bible and the newspaper, and after it had served its purpose, well, it served a few more practical ones too. And while catalogs connected the frontier to industry, other institutions were stamping official identity onto the chaos, turning gold dust and poker chips into something a bit more stable. Hard coin. 89. The San Francisco Mint, opened 1854, coined California's gold into U.S. currency, stabilizing boomtown commerce. In the frenzied days of the California gold rush, nuggets and dust flowed like water, but coinage was chaos. Miners bartered, merchants haggled, and counterfeiters had a field day. Enter the San Francisco Mint, established in 1854, and affectionately nicknamed the Granite Lady. She didn't just shine coins, she brought order to disorder. The Mint's job was straightforward but vital. Take raw California gold and turn it into standardized U.S. currency. That meant fewer bags of unweighed flakes changing hands in shady poker rooms and more official coins that could be trusted. No guesswork, no haggling, no need to bite the metal. Its presence stabilized not just San Francisco's economy, but that of the entire West Coast. Suddenly, banks could function with real confidence. Business contracts could be settled in coin, not in IOUs or speculation. And yes, taxes could be collected in something that didn't come with a gold pan. The Mint became one of the few government institutions in the region that everyone respected, because it didn't ask for trust, it created it. By the late 1800s, the San Francisco Mint was producing more coinage than any other U.S. facility, particularly in times of financial panic. And when a 1906 earthquake and fire devastated the city, the Mint survived almost untouched. Its walls held, its gold secured, and its reputation cemented. But while coin may have stabilized commerce, one thing remained stubbornly unpredictable: water. In the West, control over rivers and wells wasn't just practical, it was political. 90. Water rights doctrines in the arid West emphasized prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, unlike riparian norms back east. Out east, water rights followed a simple idea. If your land touched the river, you could use the river. But in the arid, drought-prone West, that logic didn't hold. Instead, settlers turned to a radically different system. Prior appropriation, summed up in one phrase: first in time, first in right. It worked like this. The first person to put water to beneficial use, whether for irrigation, livestock, or mining, could claim the rights to that water source, even if their land was miles from the riverbank. Later arrivals had to get in line, and if the river ran dry, senior users got priority, no matter how far upstream the new guy lived. This doctrine turned water into a legal battleground. Ditches, canals, and wells came with paperwork, disputes, and lawsuits. A stream wasn't just a natural feature. It was a commodity, a lifeline, and sometimes a loaded weapon in neighborly feuds. Water rights shaped towns, agriculture, industry, and politics. Entire settlements sprang up or withered away based on who had the paperwork to prove their beneficial use. Companies formed just to acquire and divert water. And in the hottest, driest parts of the West, a clear title to a creek meant more than gold. It was a different kind of frontier war, not fought with six-shooters, but with surveys, ledgers, and court decisions. And though invisible to the casual traveler, this legal framework still underpins much of the Western water system today. And when water couldn't get you there fast enough, or when horses stumbled in the heat, the Army turned to a most unlikely backup plan, one with a single hump and a curious attitude. 91. The U.S. cavalry often rode mules for endurance. Glamour went to horses, but supply lines loved sure-footed animals. In the painted portraits and grainy photographs of the frontier military, you'll almost always see a horse under the saddle of the U.S. cavalry, tall, noble, cinematic. But out in the real West, especially in rough terrain and long hauls, the cavalry's most reliable companion was often a mule. Why? Because mules could go longer without water, handled uneven terrain with ease, and were less prone to injury or panic than horses. They weren't fast, and they certainly weren't graceful, but if you needed to get a cannon up a canyon or haul rations over loose shale and cactus beds, a mule wasn't just preferable, it was essential. The Army learned this the hard way. Campaigns across the Southwest, Rocky Mountains, and Great Plains demanded a breed of animal that didn't just look heroic, but actually survived. Horses were used for charges and parade grounds. Mules were used for everything else: supply trains, scouts, artillery movement, and long-range patrols. Soldiers respected them, even if they didn't exactly love them. Mules had personalities: stubborn, smart, and skeptical. They were known to challenge inexperienced handlers, but once trained and trusted, they were virtually irreplaceable. And unlike a panicked horse, a mule would think twice before walking into danger, or off a cliff. So while horses got the medals and the monuments, mules kept the Army alive in places where wheels failed, rivers rose, and roads disappeared. Of course, when wheels did work, it was the stage drivers who ruled the road, sitting high, hands steady, whips cracking like punctuation. 92. Stage drivers were elite. Teamsters. Their cracking whips signaled commands more than they struck animals. To control a 6-horse stagecoach barreling across rugged terrain at full gallop required more than bravery. It required skill, endurance, and a sixth sense for chaos. That's why stage drivers were a breed apart. Part celebrity, part survivalist, part air traffic controller. Except without the radio or the runway. Driving a coach wasn't just about holding reins. It meant knowing which horse would panic at water crossings, which one leaned into turns, and how to keep them in rhythm across mud, snow, or rattlesnake-infested plains. It was like conducting an orchestra of horsepower, with every instrument ready to bolt at the sound of a thunderclap. And the whip? That wasn't for punishment. A good driver used it like a baton. A snap behind the ears might mean, pick it up. A flick near the flank could say, tighten the turn. The cracking whip was as much a language as it was a tool, and mastery of it earned a driver instant respect. Stage drivers also had to read terrain like a map. They knew where bandits might lie in wait, where wheels could snap, and where the next relay station would offer water, rest, or, if lucky, a hot biscuit and coffee. They were trusted with mail, money, and lives. When you climbed into a stagecoach, you put your fate in the driver's hands and prayed they weren't half asleep, drunk, or distracted. But no matter how elite the driver, the trip always ended the same, with a stop, a fire, and a branding iron heating in the coals. Because cattle didn't care about speed, they cared about ownership. 93. Branding irons were heated in portable fires at roundups. Spring works were as much social event as labor. Out on the open range, ownership wasn't settled by contracts. It was burned into hide. And during the spring and fall roundups, ranchers from miles around would gather not just to wrangle their herds, but to prove whose cows were whose with the glowing, unmistakable stamp of a branding iron. These gatherings, often called spring works, were part business, part festival, and fully exhausting. Branding irons were heated in portable fires, carried from camp to camp like frontier forges. Once the cattle were driven in and separated by ownership, the branding began. Hot, smoky, noisy, and chaotic. The brands themselves were a form of legal ID. Each one was registered with the county, like a property deed made of fire and hide. Some were simple, letters or symbols. Others were elaborate, almost artistic, with flourishes designed to deter rustlers and copycats. But the event wasn't just about marking cattle. It was a social ritual, a place where neighbors caught up, ranch hands swapped stories, and young cowboys tried to prove they were tough enough to wrestle calves and not get kicked into next week. Meals were communal, music sometimes played at night, and the whole thing had the air of a high-stakes campout with ropes, fire, and a constant background of mooing. Branding was brutal work, but it was also foundational to ranching life, both in a legal sense and a cultural one. Because in the West, identity wasn't just who you were. It was what you could hold on to, and how you proved it in the dust and daylight. Some left their mark in other ways, on trees, in solitude, far from crowds. And those marks are still waiting to be read. 94. Basque sheep herders left tree carvings, arbor glyphs across the Great Basin, diaries etched in bark. High in the lonely ranges of Nevada, Idaho, and Utah, far from the trails of stagecoaches and cattle drives, a quieter legacy of the West was being carved, literally, into the trunks of aspen trees. These were the arbor glyphs of Basque sheep herders, immigrants from the Pyrenees who wandered the high desert for months at a time, tending flocks in isolation. These men spent long seasons alone, with little but sheep, dogs, and sky for company. To pass the time, and perhaps to assert their existence, they carved names, dates, symbols, faces, animals, and entire scenes into the white bark of aspens. Some were playful, others deeply poetic or melancholy. They told stories in images, scratched laments, and crude calendars. Together, these marks formed a folk diary of immigrant life on the margins. Unlike most Western icons, the Basque herder didn't shoot or gamble or wrangle. He carved, he watched, he endured. And those trees are still out there, thousands of them, each bearing stories that few ever read, like whispers in a forest of ghosts. Modern historians now treat them like open-air archives, decoding the cultural fingerprints of a community that lived large in silence. From quiet carvings to rowdy camps, the West made space for every kind of outsider, and sometimes it put them all in one place, especially in the kind of town where lawlessness was both the main problem and the main attraction. 95. Deadwood, South Dakota, mingled gold mining with a rare level of lawlessness. Wild Bill was shot in a saloon there in 1876. If the American frontier had a poster child for unfiltered chaos, it was Deadwood. Founded illegally in Lakota territory during the Black Hills Gold Rush of the 1870s, Deadwood exploded into a town full of saloons, gambling dens, tents, and dreams, all perched precariously on a thin claim of legitimacy. Deadwood was a town of instant population and delayed law. At its peak, it held thousands of prospectors, drifters, entrepreneurs, and opportunists. It didn't have formal governance at first, and didn't much care. The streets were thick with mud, the nights thick with gun smoke. It wasn't a place where people settled. It was a place where they tried to get rich fast or die trying. Enter James Butler Wild Bill Hickok, one of the West's most enduring legends. In 1876, he was in Deadwood playing cards at Nuttall and Mann's saloon when he was shot from behind, allegedly holding the now famous dead man's hand of aces and eights. The story got bigger over time, but the fact remains. Deadwood was no place for legends to grow old. Yet despite, or maybe because of its volatility, Deadwood also boasted newspapers, theaters, and even telegraph lines. It was a microcosm of Western contradiction, ambition and anarchy under the same canvas roof. Deadwood burned down several times, got rebuilt, cleaned up, and eventually traded its pistols for poker chips as a tourist destination. But back in 1876, it was raw, fast, and deadly. Everything a dime novel wanted and a homesteader didn't. And if Hickok's death became a symbol, so did his hand, a tale reshuffled and replayed long after the cards were cold. 96. The dead man's hand, aces and eights, became linked to Hickok's death only decades later. Another legend grafted on. If history had a bluff, this would be it. When Wild Bill Hickok was killed in Deadwood in 1876, no one wrote down what cards he was holding. It wasn't until decades later that the term dead man's hand was popularized. And even then, the cards weren't always aces and eights. Different accounts gave different combinations. But eventually the story locked in. Black aces, black eights, and a mystery fifth card. That's the hand he was supposedly holding when he was shot, and it stuck. First in pulp novels, then in folklore, then in poker rooms across the country. It became a symbol of bad luck, doomed men, and the price of fame. In reality, no one knows what Wild Bill was holding. The saloon was chaotic. Testimonies conflicted. Some say he didn't even sit with his back to the door, a cardinal sin for a man who lived with a target on his back. But the truth didn't matter as much as the narrative. The dead man's hand became shorthand for destiny catching up, for the myth of the West writing its own endings even after the facts had folded. That's the West in a nutshell. Stories built after the gunpowder cleared, shaped by memory, legend, and the occasional flair for drama. And sometimes, amid the stories of sin and survival, the frontier made room for rules, some of them moral, some of them municipal. 97. Many towns enforced Sunday closing laws and banned gambling on the Sabbath. Morality ordinances marched with the frontier. Despite its rowdy reputation, the American West was not without its attempts at morality, or at least, moral optics. Frontier towns often walked a tightrope between vice and virtue, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the widespread enforcement of Sunday closing laws. These laws, rooted in religious observance and social decorum, were often passed as part of town charters or territorial statutes. They required that businesses close on Sundays, saloons shut their doors, and gambling be paused, at least until Monday came knocking with a hangover and a clean conscience. And while enforcement varied wildly, the symbolism was loud and clear. Even the Wild West had a Sabbath. The irony, of course, was that many of the same town councils that passed these laws had previously licensed saloons, taxed brothels, and welcomed gamblers with open ledgers. The economy ran on vices, but the image had to be Sunday school clean, at least one day a week. Some towns took it seriously. Others saw it as performative, more about appeasing churchgoers than changing behavior. And the locals? They got creative. Backroom games continued behind shuttered windows. Alcohol was medicinal on Sundays, and frontier ingenuity meant the letter of the law was followed just enough to keep the preacher quiet. These moral codes reveal a deeper truth about the West. It wasn't lawless, it was selectively lawful. Virtue and vice existed side by side, negotiated daily by necessity and custom. And when it came to land, those negotiations could turn into sprints, literally. Especially when the government dropped the flag and thousands of settlers dashed for destiny. 98. The 1889 Oklahoma land run saw thousands dash for homesteads at a gunshot. Sooners snuck in early and lent the state a nickname. On April 22, 1889, at exactly noon, a shot rang out, and the prairie thundered to life. This was the Oklahoma Land Run, a surreal spectacle of settlers on horseback, in wagons, even on bicycles, all racing to stake their claim on 2 million acres of newly opened land. But let's back up. The land in question had previously been part of Indian Territory, designated for Native American tribes under treaties that, like many others, were later overridden. When the U.S. government decided to open the unassigned lands to white settlement, it didn't do it gradually. It held a race. Homesteaders lined up on the borders, waiting for the starting gun. When it fired, chaos erupted. Dust flew, wagons broke, tempers flared. People rushed to plant claim stakes, homestead flags that had to be guarded until the claim could be filed officially. And then there were the Sooners, those who sneaked in early, hiding in gullies or sneaking past soldiers to grab prime plots before the official start. They were reviled, envied, and eventually immortalized. Today, Sooner is the nickname of Oklahoma's university teams, but it started as a dirty word among rule-abiding settlers. The land run was a strange blend of opportunity and chaos, part real estate boom, part moral contradiction. Families built lives overnight. Towns sprang up in days. And as always, those who arrived first didn't always arrive legally. But while most of the West was settling into fences and farming, one last stronghold of resistance remained. In the deserts of the Southwest, the old wars were ending, but not without one final name etched into history: 99. Apache resistance under leaders like Geronimo continued into the mid-1880s, ending with a negotiated surrender in 1886. Long after the cavalry had declared victory and the newspapers proclaimed peace, one name kept appearing in headlines and dispatches: Geronimo. For many Americans, he was a symbol of fierce resistance. For his people, the Chiricahua Apache, he was a leader, a tactician, and a survivor. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, while many native groups were being confined to reservations, Apache bands continued to resist. They knew the land, its cliffs, its canyons, its harsh, unforgiving beauty, and they used that knowledge to launch raids, elude pursuers, and sustain mobile camps in terrain others found unlivable. Geronimo wasn't alone. Apache resistance was a collective, born from desperation and resolve. But it was Geronimo who became the myth, because he refused to vanish quietly. He escaped reservations multiple times. He outwitted soldiers. He defied expectations. And ultimately, he negotiated his own surrender on his terms in 1886. The surrender marked the formal end of native armed resistance in the contiguous U.S., and with it, the closing of one chapter of the West. But it wasn't an ending in any moral sense. Geronimo and his followers were imprisoned, relocated, and never returned to their homeland. Their resistance was noble, but the costs were heavy, and the promises, as always, were broken. Still, the image of Geronimo riding free through the desert endures, not just as a rebel, but as a reminder that the frontier was never truly conquered, only renamed, fenced, and rewritten. And as the 19th century closed, a historian stepped forward to give the West a definition, one that stuck, whether or not it was true. 100. Frederick Jackson, Turner's 1893 Frontier Thesis, claimed American democracy was forged at the frontier edge. Historians still argue about it. In 1893, just 3 years after the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner stood before the American Historical Association and delivered a lecture that would reshape the myth of the West. He called it the Frontier Thesis, and its core idea was disarmingly simple. The American character, its democracy, its rugged individualism, its restless energy, was born on the frontier. According to Turner, the closing of the frontier wasn't just a geographic event. It was a psychological shift, the end of an era that had defined the nation. In his view, the challenges of the frontier, the need to survive, to build, to govern in the absence of institutions, had sculpted a new kind of citizen, different from his European ancestors, more independent, more pragmatic, more democratic. His theory was received with thunderous applause. For many, it neatly explained American exceptionalism, that persistent belief that something about the U.S. made it fundamentally different and perhaps superior to the old world, but not everyone bought it. Even then, critics pointed out that Turner's frontier was white, male, and conveniently selective. He downplayed the role of Native Americans, immigrants, women, African Americans, and the brutal cost of expansion. He made the frontier sound like a forge, but didn't ask what was burned to keep the fire hot. And yet, his thesis endured. It was quoted in textbooks, echoed in policy, and wrapped around the national myth like a bandana over a cowboy's face. Even now, historians still debate it, not because it explains everything, but because it shaped the conversation. But while Turner was defining the West in ink, others were packaging it in glitter, smoke, and gunpowder, taking the myth, polishing it, and selling it by the ticket. 101. By the 1890s, Wild West shows, dime novels, and later movies repackaged a messy, diverse, often tragic reality into a national myth, one that still rides. By the time the real West was being fenced, surveyed, and litigated into submission, a second West was just getting started, one made not of cattle or railroads, but of fiction, fantasy, and firework-loaded reenactments. The Wild West show, pioneered by Buffalo Bill Cody in the 1880s, was part circus, part rodeo, part history pageant, and all spectacle. It featured Lakota warriors performing battle scenes, sharpshooters like Annie Oakley performing impossible feats, and a curated cast of cowboys and Indians telling America what it wanted to hear: that the frontier had been wild, heroic, and ultimately tamed. At the same time, dime novels flew off the shelves by the millions. They weren't interested in nuance or truth. They wanted gunslingers, desperados, and quick-draw justice. Real figures like Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid were inflated into legends. Entire careers were built not on deeds, but on narrative control. Then came film. Early westerns leaned hard into tropes: the noble cowboy, the savage Indian, the lawless town redeemed by one man with a badge. It was myth-making on an industrial scale, and it worked. The West became America's favorite origin story. Cleaner, simpler, and far more heroic than the truth. Never mind that the real West was a mosaic of cultures, conflicts, and contradictions. That it was built by black cowboys, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, native nations, and European immigrants. Or that it was often as brutal as it was beautiful. The myth outpaced the history and still rides today in movies, books, video games, and roadside attractions. Because if the real West was lost to time, the imaginary one was just getting started. And maybe that's the real legacy: a land so big it couldn't be settled, only storyboarded. A truth so wild it had to be tamed by fiction. A frontier so alive it refuses to die.